Just some quick domestics. The toilets are just behind us. Just go out in the lobby and turn right. If there's a problem of any kind, we'll gather down in the car park against the tennis courts. And please keep sort of sensible COVID, keep COVID in mind and do sensible things all day. And we've got as much ventilation as we can. It's a terrific room and we've got windows open. And, but yell out, come to me at any time if there are problems. We'll get underway immediately. And I'd like City Council, Councillor Alex Deporto, sorry, and Deporto. We don't want to deport you, Alex. Deporto. After Will Smith. No, it's it's really terrific to have you here, and Councillor Jo Samuel-King, whom you obviously work closely with, and the council staff have been good, Sally Morgan and Michelle Pine in particular, and we're really pleased at the support. I think this is a really good thing for Bayside, and it's just terrific to have you here. So can I introduce you and Councillor Jo Samuel-King? And Jo's had a long association with this project too. She's a very keen environmentalist. So could you both take the floor, please?
Sure. Rob, is the sound system working at all?
I imagine it is.
If it's not, we're fine.
Lucas has got it all in hand, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Rob. Morning, everyone. Bayside City Council proudly acknowledges the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community members with us today. Council acknowledges the Bunurong's continuing relationship to the land and waterways and respects for their connection and spiritual identities maintained through ancient ceremonies, songlines, dance, living culture and art. Council pays tribute to the invaluable contributions of the Bunurong and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders who have guided and continue to guide the work we do. I'd like to acknowledge the attendance of my fellow councillor, Councillor Jo Samuel-King, and I think the former councillor Michael Norris. Good to see you. As Mayor of Bayside, I'm extremely excited for what's come for Elstonleigh Park Nature Reserve as we transform the former golf course into a natural oasis on our city's doorstep. The reserve will provide refuge and tranquility for both wildlife and people. A key driver of this project is to create a diverse habitat that, along with new trees and vegetation, will encourage native wildlife back to the area. And we had a wonderful guide today, guided tour from Gio, who's an excellent person to have on board, and it was really, I felt like one of those movies and the dinosaurs. I was expecting the dinosaurs to arrive because you had the cockatoos and the corellas making the beautiful noises. Really amazing, so close to the city. We recognise that the presence of noisy miners present a challenge to small bird biodiversity, and we're exploring how we can tackle this problem. We're taking steps to ensure that Elstonleigh Park Nature Reserve will be established to discourage noisy miners, and I am positive that with Gio, Jo and Marcus and all the other volunteers, the vegetation we'll do our best with the vegetation that we're growing. With the planting of more Indigenous and native mid-story and ground cover vegetation, we hope to begin to mitigate and reverse the dominance of the noisy miner, which we actually saw this morning. At our February meeting, Council resolved to focus on the implementation of the urban forest strategy, parks, linkages and habitat improvement plan, and other open space projects in an effort to improve the natural environment, particularly for small native birds. Council also resolved to recognise noisy miners as a key threatening process and a key threat to biodiversity both within Bayside and more generally in Victoria. As part of this resolution, we will make a submission to review of the Wildlife Act requesting the state government to remove the need for permits in order to actively manage noisy miners. Additionally, Council will also make representation to the state government addressing the impact of noisy miners and the negative impact on other native birds. And we're going to put up a couple of motions up at the MAB in the next few months. We're planning an extraordinary future for this magnificent reserve, creating a biodiversity refuge for exploration, education, enjoyment of our community. We can't wait to share it with you all. I just want to again make the point, I've been on council a long time. I've never ever encountered one councillor, Councillor Samuel-King, that in a year and a bit has been able to create really an incredible situation here, funded by federal, other councils, state, and our own council. It's been an amazing journey, and I think that I can say that we're really close to having the $20 million you need to build the whole master plan. Very close to it. So thank you, Joe. Really, really appreciate it. So with the
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And it's been very much a team effort, as we all know. So I want to echo the Mayor's welcome, and in the words of the Boon Wurrung Wominjeka, it's a beautiful word and I'd love it to become part of our language. I also pay my respects to the Boon Wurrung elders past, present and emerging, and particularly my respect to the Yalukit Woolam clan, whose land upon which we now stand. And I echo their call, particularly Nawi Carolyn's call, for us to care for country. And that's what today is all about, caring for country. And dare I say, sometimes caring involves hunting. So you may recall a minute ago, the Mayor said that Bayside actually resolved unanimously, the 7 of us, to make a submission to the review of the Wildlife Act, to see if we could recommend, you're going to recommend that land managers don't need a permit in order to actively manage noisy miners. And why? Well, a whole lot of reasons. So we face a real dilemma. Under federal law, noisy miners are considered a threatening process, and Gio and many others, such as Professor Clarke, will talk about the threat that they pose to biodiversity. And I certainly have seen them in action for a number of years. I recall a few years ago I was reading some work that Gio had written on noisy miners in my back garden, only to see a parlote fly over, flying for its life, being pursued in hot pursuit by noisy miners. And then Tanya, you'll also recall, and any of our bird survey people, the number of times we have seen noisy miners pursuing birds in this reserve, particularly anything new, any visitors, anything threatened, and anything small. They're amazing aerial manoeuvrers. I think the Air Force could take a lot out of how they work together, but they are absolutely, what's the word, effective at killing birds that we're actually attempting to protect. And I might just go to, how do I turn on this slide thing, if I can get it. A white-winged triller. I may be able to get this up this week. Yeah. See, that's the noisy miner chicks breeding here. And this one, a little white-winged triller. It was a beautiful call. It was having a lovely time in the reserve for a week or two. And then we found it pecked to death. You could see it was dead and it had become bald with all of the pecking of its head. And any small bird that comes here, it's not just not a refuge, it's a sink, it's a trap. And it's for us such an anathema at the moment that we have a nature reserve, or something that we call a nature reserve, that is currently a trap for small birds. So we want to have everything on the table, all options on the table to be able to manage these things, and we're really interested to listen today to the experts, and we're going to be taking notes and it's going to be videoed, and we hope with all the heads in the room that not just this nature reserve but places all across the country may be able to manage these birds so that the little ones and the threatened ones can survive and flourish. So I will hand over to a real expert, Professor
While Michael's just adjusting things, I'd like to introduce him. Emeritus Professor from La Trobe University, been around a long time and recognised as one of the real experts of noisy miners. It's just a pleasure to have you here, Michael, and thanks for helping us all the way along with our organisation.
Pleasure, Rob. Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and I hope people at the back can hear me. I'm not sure how the microphones are going, but we're good. Okay. So yes, I'm Mike Clarke. I'm from La Trobe University, and I've had the privilege of studying miners for about the last 40 years. So they are things close to my heart for all sorts of reasons. Before I begin, I want to share also the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and for everyone who's cherished the land on which they live. Just to get things straight, I'm not talking about this bird. Lots of groups, most I think I'm preaching to the converted here, know the difference, but whenever you start talking about miners, people have a vision of brownness often in their head that is really unhelpful. So no, we're not talking about that miner, we're talking about this miner, which is native. It's a large native honeyeater, and as I'll unpack in this talk, it forages in all strata and therefore poses some really major challenges. So it's not your typical honeyeater. All honeyeaters have a brushed tongue and feed often on nectar. This guy does everything. It's sedentary, so it defends a territory all year round, and for that to be possible, certain abundances of resources are needed, and I'll come back to that. I got into miners because they breed cooperatively. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, and the fact that they have more than just mum and dad raising the kids, they have relatives and neighbours all helping to raise one set of young is, in an evolutionary sense, really intriguing, and so that got me hooked at a young age as a scientist. Since then I've found that they've got other slightly less, more antisocial tendencies, but we'll get into that. Hence the next point, they're extremely aggressive and consistently aggressive. I'm going to unpack some data and some analyses we've done that show the change in the range and the density of noisy miners across eastern Australia to try and bring you up to speed with the magnitude of the challenge we're facing nationally. Now you've got in this workshop, a very local focus, and that's really appropriate, and I suspect that's the only way we're going to tackle this challenge, but it's good to get a national perspective of the magnitude of this challenge. Because it's a native species, it is listed under the Wildlife Act. It's a protected member of our wildlife community, and that raises some interesting challenges for management. So my hope in the next 30 or so minutes is to give you the background of the biology of the creature so you understand the challenge and the opportunities that are presented before us. So it's a member of the genus Manorina. So that's one little genus of honeyeaters. Honeyeaters is the most diverse group of species in Australia. And there are 4 of them, and I've had the privilege of studying all 4 over my career. The noisy miner, which you're very familiar with up the east coast of Australia, the bell miner or bellbird, a close relative, the yellow-throated miner of the inland, and then this critically endangered black-eared miner, which I would regard as the least minerish of all the miners. It's the best behaved of all of them. The rest leave a lot to be desired. Of all those 4, this chap here, the noisy, is the most well-studied of all the 4 species, and of all Australian birds, it's probably the one we know most about. It's been studied intensively since the 1970s, when it began with a Canadian biologist, Doug Dow, came to Queensland and started the first studies of colour-banded populations, individually marked birds. Because he became interested because of this cooperative breeding behaviour. It's seen around the world, but it's much more abundant, that behaviour of more than just mum and dad raising the kids. Much more abundant Australian avifauna, and the miners take it to an extreme, and I'll try and unpack that for you because it's quite complex, but it's useful for you to know. So here we have a picture of a couple of miners bringing food to a clutch of 2 or 3 young. In miners, the number of different individuals that can bring food to a single nest is enormous. And I'm going to give you an overview with what I describe as my horrendogram. This is a view of a noisy miner colony from above. And I want you to imagine we're starting with something simple like a traditional bird, mum and dad raising a set of kids. Well, they have helpers, and I'm showing here male and female helpers here, assisting that pair 3 to raise their young by bringing food and defending the nest. The really strange part, the next sort of, I guess, level of complexity that miners add to the story is that neighbouring breeders, in particular the males, will assist their neighbours to raise the neighbours' young at the same time they are raising their own young. So I've seen miners where one male was raising his own kids and also his nephews at 2 other nests on the same day. So very busy bird, rushing between fledglings or nestlings, some of his own and some belonging to a neighbour. Those neighbours, typically in a coterie, are all kin. It's mostly kin made up of brotherhoods. So the males of the pairs in this coterie are most likely brothers who have lived their entire life on that piece of land. And they will be assisting raising their nephews and nieces on the neighbouring within the coterie. The females, by contrast, when they reach breeding age, the females disperse away from the colony. So it's a female-biased dispersal system. Males stay where they always grew up. Females have to find a gap in a neighbouring colony in which to breed to establish themselves. Consequently, the females here, the females of these breeding pairs, will have come from outside. And the speed with which they can fill a breeding vacancy takes your breath away. And I did this experimentally with bell miners where I removed breeding females and to see how long it took for those gaps to be filled, and it was less than 24 hours. There's no long mourning period in miners when we make this clear. By the next morning, the male had found a new female who had to have come from outside and was copulating with her the next day. So that's the system. Within a colony, there might be another coterie made up of a different group of brothers, and together, as we saw this morning, we were out doing our wander, there was a group of about 20 miners all came into a tree and behaved like a colony. If something truly offensive entered their territory like a currawong or a kookaburra, the whole colony will mob it, and that may involve birds from multiple coteries. Okay, so they do things together very effectively, and they achieve a large area of control. So it's a complex story, but it becomes important when we talk about how effective different control measures are going to be. You need to understand the social biology of the animal. As we've already highlighted, they are aggressive, and here's a picture of them attacking a spotted dove. A group of them have decided not just to mob it, but to attack it. And that attack, as we've learned also from the example with the triller, can result in death. And this is a picture of a fan-tailed cuckoo, a migratory species that a colleague of mine watched noisy miners kill. They are also quite destructive of anything that dares to attempt to nest in their territory, and we've watched them dismantle the nests of areas they've occupied. So if a babbler nest was there, they just pull it twig by twig apart until they give up. They have, what seems to me as a biologist, a very, very crude rule of thumb on what to chase. You will see them chasing species that don't appear to be competitors, which in nature is a really quite weird system because you would think it's energetically a waste of time. But you will see them chasing things like white-faced herons, harassing and mobbing koalas, that well-known vegetarian, not a great threat to noisy miners. Echidnas, not really a profound threat. And the most extreme we've seen is them harassing and mobbing a Coke can that was blowing down the car park of the drive. But we think the simple rule is if it moves within my territory and it's not another noisy miner of my colony, I should chase it. and expel it generally. There are exceptions. There's some species they give up on, like rainbow lorikeets, they don't. There's some that they decide, presumably it's a waste of time. I haven't got many graphs or data in this talk, but I have this one because it's really important. It's a little bit complex, but I'll go through it slowly. This is a study of bird surveys throughout Eastern Australia. So about 70,000 surveys were done, counting the numbers and diversity of birds in a 1 hectare, 20-minute survey that bird watchers saw across Eastern Australia. It's an analysis led by Jim Thompson from Rob Youl and who us did, and we looked at the change. So we've got two things here: proportional richness. This is the number of different kinds of birds the person reported in that survey relative to how the density of noisy miners. So as the number of noisy miners went up, the diversity of other species declined. So the more noisy miners you had, the fewer other small bird species richness. And what's really striking, I want you to, as a take-home message from these two graphs, and this one's species richness, and this one's just the abundance of little birds. How many little birds did the person count in that survey relative to the number of noisy miners they counted? What's really spooky about this graph is the steepness of that decline. You need hardly any noisy miners to be associated with a massive drop in species richness. We're not talking the place having to be overrun with miners. We're talking 1 or 2 per hectare is enough to have a measurable effect. And that's really sobering data. So talk of reducing noisy miner density a bit. Well, yeah, you could do that, and you might push this thing back up the graph a bit, but be aware it takes very few of them to achieve this level of domination because of their social organisation. They are really good at it. And as we've learned this morning on the walk, these are the typical candidates that you won't see if noisy miners are present. A whole bunch of beautiful scarlet robins, pardalotes, spinebills, white-plumed tunnies, rufous whistlers. They might sneak through occasionally, but they won't be feeding there in a leisurely fashion, that's for sure. Now this raises the question that was interesting to us early in our research, because you could wonder and say, well, the places where you get noisy miners, you get very few birds, is it because the habitat is so clapped out, it's not much good except for a generalist like a noisy miner, or how much of this is due to the noisy miners themselves? And the way you get at that hypothesis, so this is the question, are small remnants lacking small insectivores, little picky birds, are they because they're crap habitat, or is it because noisy miners actually exclude them? And to test that properly, you need to do an experiment, which is what we did. We had a bunch of sites, some of which we removed noisy miners from, and some of which we monitored where the noisy miners stayed. Now, if our hypothesis was right, we would expect the sites at which we removed the noisy miners would become available to the little birds over time. If they didn't, we would have to conclude, well, perhaps the habitat is so clapped out it's not good for anything much but noisy miners, which, given what we've done to the landscape, is a real possibility. So this project was led by a PhD student of mine, Marilyn Gray, back in the 90s, and here we are capturing noisy miners with a yacht mast with a mist-net stretched between 2 yacht masts. The finance department of the university queried me at that point, why are you buying yacht masts? Anyway, they approved it, and we removed noisy miners. And this is one of the sites we removed them from. So this is what many would say a clapped out sheep paddock with red ironbark. What astonished us, when this is the first time this had been attempted experimentally, we were still removing noisy miners. While we were doing that, the other birds were already flooding in. It was like they were on the edges, sensitive to the defences of the noisy miners collapsing. So we saw yellow-tufted honeyeaters, spotted pardalotes. On the same afternoon, we were removing noisy miners starting to flood in. And what was interesting to me was, as a behavioural ecologist, was that the behaviour of the noisy miners changed. When they got down to 3 or 4 miners left, they started to behave like a proper honeyeater, stopped beating everything up. It was like the game was over. There were so many other little birds flooding in, they simply could not chase everything out, and they gave up. And I didn't expect to see that. Understanding noisy miner biology and why it's not a typical honey eater, you need to appreciate that it's a jack of all trades. Yes, it feeds on nectar, and we provide that abundantly in Melbourne by what we plant in our gardens. And we've really helped it along there. It's a leaf gleaner. Makes a lot of its living feeding on these things called lerps, which are the excrement-based houses built by a bug, a sap-sucking bug called a psyllid, P-S-Y-L-L-I-D. So it loves psyllid infestations. It can also bark glean if it needs to. It can also hawk insects if it needs to. It'll feed very happily on the ground, which is a very unusual thing for a honey eater to do. It spends a lot of its time on the ground if you create the habitat for it. So here's one dispatching a prey mantis. They are extraordinarily adaptable. So corn chips, that'll be okay too. Any leftover in a drink can. One that took my breath away was sitting at the cafe, and a noisy miner came up to the sugar satchels and whacked the living daylights out of the sugar capsule until it spilt the sugar on the table, and it worked it out completely at the cafe. So just looked like a big papery sort of caterpillar. Whoa, this is all right, I'll eat that. So this is a very adaptable species, and it exploits all sorts of niches. I want to dwell a little bit on this part of the story because it's a complex one, and it's one that seems to be a bit of a driver behind noisy miner expansion, but we don't have good handles on it. I want to talk about psyllid outbreaks. As I said, psyllids are sap-sucking bugs. This is an adult. It's tiny. It looks a bit like a poor man's cicada. Very, very, very tiny cicada. The nymphs grow under these lerps. The lerps are primarily a sugar carbohydrate fix, so wonderful food for a bird. And understanding psyllid outbreaks is still a work in progress in Australia, and it has been for the last, 60 years. We really don't understand them well. We know there's a number of factors that contribute. Psyllids need, these psyllid become outbreaks when you have masses of them on a tree, and then they'll suddenly disappear. So you'll have waves of psyllid outbreaks. And they clearly, different species of psyllid go to different species of eucalypt, and they can have multiple species of psyllid on the one eucalypt. Different ones use leaves of different ages. They seem to occur when the eucalypt is stressed and is unable to produce all the nasty toxins it normally puts into its leaves to stop itself being eaten. So it's when the eucalypt's defences are down. They often are associated with periods when there's lots of good nutrients in the eucalypt leaves in the form of soluble nitrogen compounds. So we need to be thinking, what are we doing to landscapes when we revegetate them? Are we making the trees the leaves more palatable to psyllids? For the little psyllid to suck the phloem and get the goodness out of the leaf, the leaf needs to be turgid or full of water. It's not a good sucker, it's not a powerful sucker, but if there's lots of moisture, that will enhance the chance of the psyllid being able to make a living out of it and have the energy to suck out of those leaves. In nature, there are a whole bunch of things apart from noisy miners that eat psyllids or their lerps and that help control them. One of them is this parasitoid wasp. Well, there's a whole family or group of parasitoid wasps with the imaginative name of Cylobagus, not surprising. That's a 1 millimetre size bar. These are tiny, tiny little wasps, parasitoid wasps, that lay their eggs inside the psyllid under the lerp and help control the psyllid populations. On top of this story, there are then parasites of the parasites. There are hyperparasites who parasitise the wasp. And if these things are too abundant, then you can have a psyllid outbreak because the normal break on the psyllid population is not there anymore. So I guess the take-home message of this complex story is that it's complex and that psyllid outbreaks are something we still have lots to learn about. The consequence for the tree is not great. So you'll have local leaf necrosis or dying of the leaf. You could have the whole leaf falling off. You could have ants feeding on the excrement and farming the excrement of the psyllids, such that the psyllids are in effect defecating so much sugar that that sugar is streaming on the trees, with providing enough food for a sooty mould to grow on the trees. And that's particularly what you might see on spotted gums around here, where you get a black sooty cover on the tree because of the psyllid excrement being colonised by a mould. So it's a complex story. The bottom line is loss of vigour and potentially tree death. So this is without noisy miners. Psyllids are a challenge to understand. And more likely when trees are stressed, dry summers following very wet winters is the pattern, but the patterns are all over the place, and I don't know what psyllid populations are going to do with climate change, be affected by climate. So I'm anticipating things will go pear-shaped on a regular basis with climate change, because you only need to whack out some of these guys with bad weather and the brakes on psyllid populations may have been removed, the natural brakes. You've also got all these characters, lacewings, mantids, ladybirds, that we do things to in our gardens that would normally control psyllids that may not be there. So it's a complex web we've interfered with. A little bit more psyllid biology, and I apologise for this slide, but this is a landscape scale view. We did some research looking at the kind of places in landscapes that noisy miners preferentially set up their colonies. And we did surveys. We knew noisy miners like edges. They like eucalypts, beside grassland. And we did surveys along the edges of continuous blocks of vegetation. So the noisy miners were obviously, they are in this landscape, long corridors in a farmland. So this is paddocks, and this is a big block of bush, and this is another big block of bush. But they also occupied the edges. But it wasn't just anywhere in the edges that they occupied. It turned out they occupied the pointy bits. This is a very technical ecological term. The pointy bits, the sharp corners that stuck out. It seemed as if these were the easily defensible places where you could see any intruder coming from a distance. So this has ramifications which I'll come back to in terms of habitat restoration. So, noisy miner habitat selections, the questions that go through their mind, possibly, is me anthropomorphising, but anyway, this is the decisions that they've had to come up with. Can I get enough carbohydrates to occupy this site all year round? This is a sedentary species that occupies a year-round territory. My gut feeling is that we have tipped the balance in Melbourne and lots of Eastern Australia to make that possible in vast hectares of landscape. We've provided water, we've provided nectar-producing plants, we water our trees, we add fertilisers, we make it more likely that there will be the possibility of hanging on here all year round. I don't think pre-invasion Melbourne was like that. I think it would have had patchiness in time of resources, but we've made this place an oasis that is great all year round. The next question is, if there is good all year round food supply, can I defend it without too much hassle? Is this a spot that I can colonise? If so, let's move in and take over. And I've watched that and I've documented that a number of times in various papers I've written, where I've watched the noisy miners take an unoccupied piece of landscape, tree by tree, as a coordinated group, and just beat everything up in their path. And I think from what Gio was saying, that's been an occurrence in the last few years on this very site. National picture, it's getting worse. This is a graph showing patterns in changes between the two atlases run by BirdLife Australia, 1998 data to 2012, and all the dark areas are places where there's been an increase in the density of noisy miners in that period. It's getting worse. Why? Well, ever since white settlement, we've been on a noisy miner habitat creation scheme, and we've done it really well. We have created stacks and stacks of habitat that just suits them to a T. Classic farmland with eucalypts, sparse eucalypts, and a grassy, highly grazed understory, short understory. And these things called golf courses, they are just sensational noisy miner habitat. And I challenge you to listen to any recording of a golf competition and not hear noisy miners in the background. I think they have every tea covered. So they've benefited from land clearing, from fragmentation of the continuous woodlands and forests. We've had prolonged overgrazing, and we've created grassy parklands. And on top of that, we've then planted non-local carbohydrate-rich trees and shrubs, providing a very reliable source of nectar and lure. To the extent that if I think back to my childhood, here's me aged 10, this is the, and some of you may have had this bird chart on your walls when you were growing up if you're old enough. This is the Gould League of Bird Lovers of Melbourne. This is what you hope to see, and I did as I grew up in the eastern suburbs. Noisy miners there, but there was a whole bunch of these insectivorous little birds that were also there. If you move now to the Birds in Backyards current poster, there's a real feel that I think the diminutive size of these little birds here is actually quite representative of how small are the big parrot birds and the cockatoos and the aggressive things bigger than a noisy miner. There's been big changes, and I don't know whether people in Melbourne actually appreciate how drastic that's been. As Jo said earlier, formally, once we'd published a lot of this work, we finally got federal recognition that this was a national problem. Thanks, Rob. The magnitude of the adverse effect of noisy miners on threatened species of bird like swift parrot, like Regent honeyeater, was of such seriousness that it was listed as a threatening process, a nationally threatening process, which means, in theory, governments are meant to do something about that once you list it. They are meant to enact an action plan or a recovery plan to address that threat. In Australia and Victoria, we're not very good at it. We're very good at listing. We're crap at working out action plans, and that's really lovely. But we seem to love listing, and that's an important first step. What's meant to follow in a logical world is you then commit money to enact an action. You work out an action plan, what do we need to do, and you fund what needs to be done. We haven't been splash about that. So, listed nationally in 2014. Before that, Victoria was led the way. 2011, New South Wales, 2013, listed as a nationally threatening process. And so, therein lies the challenge. What can we do? Well, in terms of locally and landscape restoration terms, we need to make remnants as large as we possibly can. Noisy miners tend not to like continuous forest or woodland, although they will penetrate as far as 150 metres into a continuous woodland, as our research shows, which is quite humbling. But we can also think about being cleverer in how we revegetate. We've had a lot of emphasis on corridors in the past in revegetation, which are important, linking habitats between things. But if the corridor is completely controlled and dominated by noisy miners, its value is diminished. So when we think about thickening up or adding vegetation to a landscape, we need to think about adding curves, not pointy out bits. So if I here got a clump, let's bring out the whole edge to that clump rather than just a little corridor to that existing old tree. Or if we've got a corner, can we smooth it off? The noisy miners love these corners. They're prominent places they can sit and watch and get an almost 360 view of everything that's coming into their territory. So what can we do in the way we think about landscape restoration? So make remnants as large as possible, aim for smoothing, increase the structural complexity of the ground. Vegetation. As I said, noisy miners like to spend a lot of time foraging on the ground, which is unusual for a honeyeater. My impression is they don't like getting their tail wet. If you ever watch them, they spend a lot of their time with their tail cocked, which is a really odd stance for a honeyeater. So the more complexity we can make for the ground layer, the better. But as humans, we love, there's a mower just outside there, going round and round. I wish he'd stop. But mowing things and keeping lawns short suits noisy miners to a T. And we can do that in our own gardens. We can diversify our plantings, and Gio's much more expert on this than me. He'll be unpacking some of the steps you can take to tip the balance away from being in favour of noisy miners. But we can start immediately by less mowing of our lawns, increasing the ground layer, promoting dense understory. I'm sure Gio will expand on that. And diversifying the food-bearing plants beyond just nectar. In the 1970s, when I was growing up, it was the big thing. We planted our gardens with lots of Banksias and Grevilleas, and I think we've played into the hand of the noisy miner. I now need to talk about the elephant in the room. What about lethal control? We've had a history of being involved in this in our research group, and we had some of the early successes in lethal control. And that's what Marilyn and Gray's work. And we got remarkable results of an influx of native species of bird when we removed noisy miners. Others have not had similar success, and they've removed large numbers, thousands of noisy miners without success, only to find the sites from which they removed noisy miners were backfilled. And they've removed, I think it was 3,000 in these. So what can we learn from this? What might be driving these very patchy different results? It's not a clear-cut story, and I think it comes down, my hypothesis, it comes down to social organisation and what you've actually removed. So I'm going to walk you through some possible scenarios if you attempted culling. The first one I'm going to talk about is our early experience. So I'm imagining you've removed a coterie and you've created some noisy miner-free habitat. Your ideal in that situation is that the colony contracts what it attempts to defend, and this unoccupied habitat becomes available to other small insectivores. That's the ideal scenario, and we were able to do that multiple times in the Lurg-Benalla area with success, and it lasted. Much to our astonishment, it lasted for years. It wasn't a constant experience of having to keep culling. Once we removed them, in many of those sites they remain absent. Another possibility though, is that the noisy miners in the adjacent coterie simply just expand. One coterie's gone, the next coterie just expands. It's now lower density, and it just picks up the boundary and keeps defending it, and all you've got is fewer defenders. But for the little bird trying to get in, the spotted pardler trying to use that, what you cleared of noisy miners, it's slightly better, but not much at all. So they might get chased a little bit less often, but basically it's uninhabitable. And that was a distinct possibility in some of the culling episodes that didn't work. Another possibility is that this one may not expand to fill the gap you've created, but some noisy miners in the district just upgrade their real estate. They move from what was moderate noisy miner habitat to now you've made available really good noisy miner habitat that has no noisy miners in it, and they simply move. And this is the astonishing result that the folk in inland New South Wales got, was the speed with which that happened. So these folk were shooting hundreds of noisy miners to the point there's not a sound of a noisy miner in this 30-hectare block they're shooting in. To come back the next day and it's full of noisy miners. The neighbours had simply upgraded their real estate and just shifted in. So that is a possibility. So this is a significant challenge when you've got a landscape saturated with noisy miners. To give you a scale feel about it, this is the location of the first removals we ever did in the Lurg area. These names are properties from which we removed noisy miners. We only removed 159 noisy miners over a 12-month period from about 32 hectares. A tiny proportion of the local landscape we removed. We got some successes and we got a couple of failures. But I think we need to be sanguine or realistic about the magnitude of the challenge we're up against. If I think back to my ancestors who were up against rabbits, and they said, oh, we're planning to only remove 10% of the rabbit population from this area, and we think we're going to have success. well, you'd say you're dreaming. That's just delusional. And I don't think we've quite grasped the magnitude of the noisy miner challenge yet. So I think this reserve has the potential to be an exemplar of a haven, and we get a feel for what is it going to take? What is it going to take to actually achieve this? I'm not saying it's unachievable, but I think it's a great place to have a crack. So, in conclusion, we created the mess, and my mum always taught me if I made a mess, it was my job to clean it up. So, I don't think we can walk away and simply say, well, miners are doing what miners have always done. That is true, but they're not doing it off their own back. We have actually set them up to try it. So we need to rectify it and think about how we're going to modify landscapes to tip the balance the other way and stop creating more noisy miner habitat. I guess my take-home message is culling can work at a local scale in many situations, but not all. And if we go, we should only be contemplating doing it when we're really serious, as you folk are here, in really serious habitat restoration, where the impacts on other species are clear, particularly if you're also looking at dieback of eucalypts. So we're looking at trees that might be hundreds of years old dying. We need to appreciate the time scale of what we're attempting here and the urgency of what we're attempting. 100-year-old trees that are dying because of licilid infestations, possibly exacerbated because of noisy miner domination. Those trees are not going to be replaced quickly. We may plant lots, but we need to appreciate we're losing crown jewels here at a rate of knots. Can only be done under permit, and Ian's going to unpack the challenges of that. And we don't just do these things, we need to learn from what we're doing. There needs to be a commitment. If you're going to take something's life, you need to be learning how to do this well, how do we do it better, how do we do it as humanely as we possibly can. So I guess I've just tried to set the scene. That's the challenges as I see it from my understanding of the bird's biology. But really thank and congratulate the team on having a crack at such a thorny problem. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. That's superb. There's time for a couple of questions, and then we'll have a short break. And that's really terrific. And thank you, Jo, as well, for the wonderful municipal contribution.
I haven't spoken much about natural predators. What's that end look like?
Natural predators of noisy miners. The usual raptors are natural predators. So the goshawks, the sparrowhawks. Given how much they hate kookaburras as nest predators, they're quite effective, but they are so good. They have a series of alarm calls, and the colony works like a $1,000 system. And you've probably witnessed it here. If anything threatening moves into the territory, the whole colony knows, which gives them a profound advantage. They are the weirdest bird in begging. I don't know if you've ever heard noisy miners beg. I've measured it. You can hear them over a kilometre away. That is the dopiest thing for a bird to do, unless your defences are really sound. Most birds begging, you only hear when the adult just arrives. Noisy miners, the fledglings, you heard a kilometre, said, come and eat me, come and eat me. But the fact they're still here suggests to me that they are really good at combating their natural predators. Sorry, there's a question in the room too.
I was just wondering, all the studies that you showed were in rural situations, and we're in an urban setting here. So I just wondered how you extrapolate those learnings to the situation we have here, because also if we do things on the ground here, there's a million little habitats, like, you know, just in front of my house, I've got an infested spotted gum with lurker on it, and noisy miners love it. So I was just wondering how we can extrapolate some of your learning.
I'm not sure we can, but I reckon you're in the prime seat to have a crack at it and learn from it. So there's the
so we can follow on and
monitor
set up
and
a study from
let's see what's going on.
Yeah, great.
I don't think anyone's tried it. George may talk later, I don't know. We haven't had a crack at the Trove. There's another opportunity there to see and we must learn.
So in a way, this could be a guiding light.
Absolutely,
So, yeah,
absolutely.
right.
For all of Eastern Australia, that's
Yeah.
the bit, because everyone up the eastern coast is facing similar dilemmas.
And just one quick question then, if you put the comparative populations of noisy miners in these urban settings with the rural, have there more here in the urban or less?
Jacinta may actually have data on that. Jacinta Humphrey's doing a PhD on peri-urban birds and has been counting all these things. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I didn't extend into rural areas, the same as mine, but definitely they are incredibly high numbers in areas with high density housing. But they are also extending out to the urban fringe, so it's hard to say.
It'd be worth looking at. I don't know what the actual densities are. I guess my escape from that question is that any's too many.
Yeah.
That's what our data suggests. That's,
Yeah, okay.
yeah, that's the really spooky part about it.
Well, thank you.
Last one.
With feral deer, I'm aware that you have to cull basically 35 to 50% of the population each year to keep them under control. Have any studies been done to suggest what we might need to do to keep noisy miners population?
No, we don't have a feel for the numbers we're going to need, but it's going to be massive, and I hope we'll get into in the discussion in the Q&A. The educative conversation we're going to have talking about deer is really quite straightforward by comparison with talking about shooting a native bird. Yeah. And we don't have a good estimate of how many we're going to do.
Thank you, Michael. Really terrific. Two domestic things. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Rob Youl, live in South Melbourne and associated with Westgate Park, and I'm a retired forester. Well, thought I'd get some booze. and also a land care worker, land care project. So, and I'm a friend of Gio's. And the other domestic thing is, Marcel, please put your hand up the back. Marcel is taking the registrations, and she's just ticking you off. So, ticking off your name on my list. So, good to see her if you haven't already done so. Thanks very much. There's some morning tea, which thanks everyone. Our next speaker is Ian Tenby, Ian Tenby, and Ian's been for decades. I've always thought him as one of the mainstays of what was originally the Fisheries and Wildlife branch, then the division, and then the various machinations and commutations and terminations of the Environment Department. And he retired about 10 years ago, and he's still a very active consultant, and of course consults for the department as well. So lovely to have you here, Ian, and thanks very much indeed.
Machine where you can have a drop. There we are. not showing it here. Okay, that's fine. Right. What I'm looking at here is not what you're seeing up there, so that's fine. So I've been asked to talk about the ethics of ecosystem management. And as I'll explain in the next slide, I'm not a bioethicist, but I want to talk about some of the challenges to do with ethics, what ethics is. I'm not talking much about noisy miners, but I'm talking about situations in which you can see some of the challenges in applying ethics and trying to resolve a range of different situations where decisions are made that aren't consistent within each situation because of what species you're dealing with. And I think that's a really important consideration because it relates to partly how you go about educating people to accept that some sort of intervention may be required. And I'd like also to reiterate something Mike said, that we have created a huge imbalance since colonisation. We've messed up many habitats, maybe most, and I think it's the onus is on us to try and rectify that where we can, where we've got the capacity to do it, if we don't want to lose sister species and ecosystems. As I said, I'm not a bioethicist. I did chair the Arthur Institute Animal Ethics Committee and the Wildlife and Small Institutions Animal Ethics Committee for several years. And I sat on the Victorian Animal Ethics Committee's Advisory Committee, which advises ethics committees on the running and on ethics. I chaired the Independent Panel of Experts, which is a group set up by DELP, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, to advise it on contentious wildlife management issues, so that they've got a scapegoat when they make a public decision that they like to deflect criticism on. And on the Flying Fox Expert Panel, which advised the Sydney Botanic Gardens on the relocation of flying foxes there, which was now successful. All of these positions require consideration of ethical issues in wildlife management. So while I don't have specific ethics training or background, I've had some experience in looking at these sorts of issues from an ethical point of view. So, what is ethics? It's defined in the Macquarie Dictionary as a system of moral principles by which human actions and proposals may be judged good or bad, or right or wrong. Now, of course, moral principles aren't fixed. It depends on whose principles they are, whose morals they are. A paper by Gamborg et al., titled Ethics of Wildlife Management and Conservation, What Should We Try to Protect, was published in 1912. And they said, what should we protect when managing and conserving wildlife? There's no single answer. Competing values and different prioritisations of values create ethical dilemmas and disagreements in which human needs, preferences and interests, concern for individual animal welfare and the value of biodiversity, ecosystems and wild nature are part of the discussion. The way in which these different values are prioritised will determine policy, and I'll refer to some examples later on. Explicit consideration of the values at stake should underpin careful debate about, for instance, whether constant human involvement in nature reserves and other wildlife areas is desirable, and what constitutes good and bad human interventions in relation to wildlife. There's an extensive literature on ethics in wildlife management, but in summary, it's about values and it's complicated. I hope the following slides will illustrate this. Consider a grey mammal with a long tail. It can increase to numbers that result in damage to the environment and impacts on other species. It also causes damage to crops and infrastructure. It's not native to Australia. For lethal control of this species is unquestioned. The methods are used that have negative, even lethal impacts on other species, and the humanity of methods is questionable in many cases. The black radish is an acknowledged pest. Lethal control of such a pest is justified to manage its impacts, ideally in combination with other measures where possible to control its numbers, such as removing food sources and exclusion. And I think there's a lesson in that with any species, rather than simply culling, you should be trying to change the situation that led to that imbalance in population as well, so that you're not having to just cull and cull and cull. And even with rats, that's the case. Some of the lethal methods used to control it are inhumane or cause secondary poisoning of other species. I would argue that this is not ethical. For example, the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which you may have heard of recently in the media, the SGARs, are readily available in supermarkets and hardware stores and commonly used, but they accumulate in animals that eat SGAR-affected sick or dead rats and themselves may be compromised or die. A number of Australian studies, including by Deakin University recently, have shown that this is a significant problem for powerful owls and booble cows, while a recent British study links a national decline in kestrel numbers across the UK to SGARs. It is a big problem. Other studies in Europe and North America highlight the impact of SGARs on a range of predatory birds and mammals. If we use the definition of ethics, a system of moral principles by which human actions and proposals may be judged good or bad or right or wrong, few people would argue that it's good or right to kill rats with poisons that go on to kill other non-target species, even if they believe that killing rats is appropriate. Unfortunately, our regulatory authorities don't seem to agree, and these products are still readily available and promoted, and most people in the public just don't know the impacts. If we consider, another grey mammal with a long tail, it can increase to numbers that result in damage to the environment and impacts on other species, just as the black rat does. It also causes damage to crops and infrastructure. It's native to Australia. Lethal control of this species is undertaken, but is controversial. The methods used must be humane. Now, it's a big distinction. There's no legal requirement for methods to be used that are humane for one of the traps that I've seen promoted is a bucket with a tilting lid. There's a bait in the top, and the rat falls down into water in the bottom. Now that's a very inhumane way to kill a rat. It swims around and around and around until it's cold and exhausted and eventually drowns. You could never get away with doing that to a kangaroo. You need a mighty big bucket anyway, but standards differ, even though the ethical situation doesn't, and that's the key point here. Through colonists' alteration of the environment and removal of its predators, populations of the eastern grey kangaroo have been able to increase to a boom and bust cycle regulated not by predation but by food availability now, with the population increasing even during mild droughts. And the point is that eastern grey kangaroos keep breeding until a drought is very severe. Mild drought doesn't stop them breeding, and they can increase by up to 40% per year through natural increasing. Until lack of food causes widespread starvation and population crash. In the process, kangaroos overgraze and remove vegetation necessary for a diverse range of other fauna, from invertebrates to a suite of threatened woodland bird species. And I don't think many people recognise that kangaroo grazing and browsing is one of those factors that does affect a whole suite of woodland bird species. They're under severe pressure, exacerbated by noisy miners, of course. In this situation, we've created an imbalance that leads to negative impacts on the environment and loss of biodiversity. If we value that biodiversity, we need to replace the predation that used to be the role of dingoes and First Nations people with culling. It could be argued that it's unethical not to do so, provided that it's done humanely, and this is entirely feasible. Nevertheless, there are strident objections by a minority of activists who claim that killing kangaroos is wrong, that they are threatened with extinction, It's laughable with the eastern grey kangaroo. And it's not done humanely. And admittedly, in cases it's not done humanely, but it can be, and by ethical shooters, it is done humanely. Okay, now the really curly one. Right, here we are. Consider a third grey mammal with no tail. It can increase to numbers that result in damage to the environment and impact on other species. Lethal control of this species is generally not permitted, and other options are used or not to control its impacts on the environment. Is it the lack of a tail that prohibits culling of this species? Or that it cannot run away? Or that it is cute? And that bottom image is an avenue, I call it the avenue of death, down in the Otways. Those trees were all killed by koalas. Now that's a substantial impact on the environment, and it's not just along the roadway. The koala is a national icon, threatened in New South Wales and Queensland, yet overabundant in parts of Victoria, where its overbrowsing has caused the loss of thousands of trees. Interestingly, a recent study, I think it was Close et al., suggested that the natural density of kangaroos at the time of European arrival was so low as to be almost undetectable. The first koala sighting reported by Europeans occurred 10 years after colonisation of the Sydney Basin. Clearly they are not in the numbers that we see in the Otways. Koalas have been a valued food source for First Nations people and were preyed upon by dingoes. So I think that, plus the changes that we created to the environment subsequently as well, are probably the reasons why koalas were at a much lower density and probably a sustainable density back then. Management has usually been by relocation of koalas to other areas, in some past cases leading to another patch of destroyed forest and koala population collapse. And Sandy Point, Framlingham would be two cases in point, among many. Fertility control of koalas is now often used to curb population growth with implantable slow-release hormone implants, with euthanasia of some individuals in poor condition deemed too unfit for the stress of relocation. And in some cases, relocation is the only available option, subject to removal of those animals that aren't fit enough, to reduce an overpopulation situation, which is such as in the Otway area. Yet culling by shooting is taboo. Why are the different standards? From an ethics viewpoint, the situations of these three species are similar. Clearly, human values and conceptions have a strong role in determining what actions are deemed acceptable for a particular species. What is considered right or wrong is not black and white. Valuing feral species. Feral pigs are an acknowledged threat to ecosystems, crops and livestock. Helicopter shooting, recreational shooting, trapping and poisoning are widespread and accepted practices. And I should point out when I'll talk about poisoning that sodium nitrite has recently been introduced as a relatively very humane poison for pig control to replace what used to be used, 1080 and other things. So it's now an acceptable practice. And they've got really neat hoppers that pigs lift up with the snout to get at the food inside, no animals can get at it. And they eat the sodium nitrite laced poison and they die from that. Several species of deer are now established and abundant in Victoria and elsewhere in Australia and cause environmental damage, massive damage, and they're increasing and have increased dramatically in the last 20 years. They're a valued hunting resource, remain protected in Victoria despite the damage they cause, but shooting is accepted. Feral horses that cause extensive lasting damage in the high country and elsewhere, threatening unique ecosystems and species. Control is highly controversial. Helicopter shooting by skilled shooters is probably the most humane method to reduce their numbers and impacts. Yet this is not permitted because horses are valued differently to other feral species in spite of their ecological impacts. And I would argue that up at Kosciuszko, where I've seen the impacts of these horses, they are far worse than the impacts of pigs and deer, which are relatively lower numbers up there. If it's considered an ethical obligation to protect native ecosystems from the impacts of feral animals, and from overabundant or out of balance native species, and humane culling is considered acceptable for some of those species, then it seems illogical from an ethics viewpoint to reject humane culling for other species having similar impacts. It seems that the decisions about culling or not are not so much based on ethics but on other values. The iconic status of koalas, for example, the values hunters place on deer as a game animal and their influence on government policy, and the place of horses in Australian cultural traditions and the emotional attachment that people have with this species. And our ecosystems are losing out as a result. Another native species, which also happens to be grey, the noisy miner, has benefited greatly from habitat modification wrought by humans, and as Mike Clarke has eloquently explained, harasses a number of other bird species, such that tree health can be compromised by increased psyllid populations. We've again created an imbalance that leads to detrimental impacts for biodiversity and the sustainability of some habitats. If we wish to slow this loss of biodiversity due to the actions of noisy miners, there are options. Planting understory shrubs that provide protection for the smaller birds important for tree health, but targeted by noisy miners, may enable these birds to persist in spite of the presence of noisy miners. And I think this was the point that Gio was making earlier for those who went on the wildlife route. Other manipulations, such as replacing some of the eucalypts with other indigenous species, such as banksias, acknowledging that they produce nectar, but she oaks, wattles, may reduce the attractiveness of an area for noisy miners. Until such habitats have grown, I believe there's a sound ethical argument for humane culling of noisy miners to protect the health of the eucalypts and to allow the other smaller birds to re-establish and strengthen their populations. This should lead to better tree health and greater biodiversity. And I look forward to the experiments that are due to occur here, and I would certainly urge all possible monitoring to be done of that process. Thank you. There'll be a question and answer session later in the morning, but because I've been brief, maybe this time now.
I think the time for one question, please. Any pressing questions? No. We'll move on. Thanks. That's fascinating. George. Hey, nice to see you again. Haven't seen George for years. Now, George is a great bloke, and I've known him for quite a while, and he's a real feature of Latrobe. Anyone who goes to Latrobe sees it's surrounded by bushland reserves, and George managed them for decades with a great deal of community spirit too. He's a person who's always worked with lots of people. He's very creative, and I'm so pleased that he was available to come along today. George Paris.
I struggle with technology. My background actually is green restoration, revegetation, but it actually started with an interest in native freshwater fish from my high school days and some student involvement in voluntary organisations, friends groups, local conservation groups to the era I moved, and student ecological societies. I studied agricultural science, which is almost the antithesis of restoration. And I ended up in this accidental career in conservation of 36 years with the Latrobe University Wildlife Sanctuary, but I've maintained my involvement in naturalist groups, friends groups, community action, tangible on-ground action, and even now in my retirement from Latrobe, very active in that sphere. There's a lot of really good work going on in the Landcare area in particular, in vast rural areas and catchments. For those of you interested, have a look at what the Rivers for Carbon project participants, private landholders are doing in upper catchments in the upper Murrumbidgee and elsewhere in Australia, but also what groups are doing in the Melbourne area is just just commendable. And we need to sort of keep that energy going. We need to keep it resourced, and hopefully some things I shared with you today about revegetation as the basis of regrowing wildlife habitat. will hopefully be useful to you in this area, but also other projects that some of you here today are involved in. So I'm looking at tangible practical things we can do to support biodiversity for birds, but I'll try and cover up the areas. It's a short half-hour thing. You'll probably have to drag me off at half-hour mark. So I'll move on. When I look at restoration, revegetation, what we're working with is with the layers of land use history. On any site, there's those that came before European invasion. We see evidence of them. We have some survivors. We have stories that have passed down generations. We also have the scars of even surveyors over the scars of the previous First Nations people. And we've also got recollections of first contact, European writers. A book that I found quite handy by Graham Busy, looks like a coffee table book called The Separate Creation, but within that he includes accounts of what some of the first people, particularly in the Melbourne area, but also like extracts from Cook's diary, day one, in Botany Bay. And certainly reading some of these early records can inspire you a vision of what once was. We probably need to get back to that, but in terms of restoring systems, restoring former communities, we need to have that in the back of our mind, what those natural areas look like. Even surveyors' maps, early maps of the Melbourne area, they show certain features, they show certain hilltops, they show woodlands, they show honeysuckles, the Banksias that Ian mentioned, honeysuckle flat, honeysuckle creek, etc. So through those readings, through those early records, through things in the museums, through the records of naturalists, we can imagine even the fauna of the Melbourne region, vastly different and depauperate today, or fragmented and threatened. Early photographs, something that you could start in the 1940s. This is showing an area on Darrington Creek, where present day the Trade University is. A project I was involved in was set up in this area. But even looking at the evidence, you can see where the remnant woodland was, which paddocks in that farming history were probably less cultivated, less fertilised, which were totally transformed and ploughed, maybe even market gardens, etc. So understanding the land you're starting with, the history of why that mental asylum was there, how they used that land, what happened before then, from 1832 when the Heidelberg or Engel land sales happened, and the various property holders, the history of fertiliser addition, and things like that are something you need to look into for your restoration project. And so we're looking at areas that have been partially restored. These photos taken back, sort of 20 years ago. But you see two different layers of history. You see the revegetation history, and you see what was probably mid-1800s land use, the corners of paddocks. So some of the early work done at the Trade University in the 70s, before my time, involved taking advice by the then Fishes and Wildlife Division, one expert in particular, Sid Cowling, some of you might know him and his work, and he helped the university, he served on the committee, and he had all these great ideas, and even to this day, when you go to the DELP website and try and download a pamphlet, a brochure on how to improve your farm land, you more or less see the template that Sid Cowling laid down with his work at Serendip at the Arthur Isle Institute back in the 70s. Some great stuff about sort of getting vegetation into wetlands, artificial farm dams. That's the university motor system, a highly engineered system. And they started planting, putting logs in and doing all that sort of stuff way back then. The sort of stuff which has now become an accepted industry, wetland restoration, constructed wetland restoration. And of course, there were remnant areas near the Trade University to model this on, areas like Crescent Forest. around the former Greswold Sanatorium, it's a tuberculosis sanatorium. So there was 90-year-old regenerated woodlands with remnant vegetation. There were other remnants along the Yarra, Plenty Gorge, Yarra Bend, from which to collect wild seeds, billabongs along the Yarra, swamps up at Yangee, up near Whittlesea, to collect seeds for wetlands. And there were areas nearby that were golf courses that were later converted to areas of Crown land reserved for nature conservation, with fairways that were being actively restored, and something that I was involved in those years with many participants, many helpers, turning golf courses back into functioning woodland ecosystems, ephemeral wetland drainage lines, and areas of biodiversity. This one in particular that I mentioned is now known as the Greswold Habitat Link Nature Conservation Reserve. And this is an earlier photograph. We had issues about edges, perfect golf course, noisy minor habitat. And so our focus was on understanding the microclimate, targeting our revegetation efforts on the areas most transformed, both through past land use, but also through exposure and microclimate. So the first thing we did when we stepped on there, we targeted the western boundary, providing winds from the west, the northwest, the southwest, whether it's summer or winter, affects the microclimate in that ephemeral creek valley. Further east, there were remnants, some good regeneration, obviously different land use in that paddock in its history. But we targeted this western boundary in particular. We targeted weed patches. We targeted substituting the highest priority weed patches with indigenous dense revegetation and plantings that match those sites. So matching the sites is very important. When I look out here, I see the focus on the wetlands already well underway, but I'm seeing these artificial mounds. Mounds of fill, high and dry. They're always going to be problematic. And yet, some of our greatest gains for enhancing wildlife and biodiversity may be targeting some of those most difficult sites as well early in our progress. So, if you think about mammals, people look at the big koalas, the kangaroos, etc. But our greatest form of diversity in mammals in the Melbourne region is probably insectivorous microbats. These are placental mammals, they're not marsupials, they're active at night. I won't spend too much time on them, but we know that they depend on the hollows, many of them, and particularly hollows that are too small for birds. There are nesting boxes that have been developed that do work to some extent, but nowhere near as good as the natural stuff. We know that some of them use loose bark on trees, accumulated masses of bark, particularly manna gums, or exfoliating sort of slabs of bark or splits in trees. Food and sustenance is so important for those small mammals. They're literally flying around any night of the year that it's mild enough and productive enough for them to be out hunting for insects. And they're constantly eating. High metabolic rate, the smaller the mammal, the higher metabolic rate. So that balance between survival and failure is highly dependent on the food supply. So what we really need is an insect-supportive, diverse understory. And this is where I emphasise the case for Indigenous trees versus non-Indigenous trees. One of the biggest problems we're facing in the last couple of years or so is this fad in local government called urban forestry, which is different to the urban forestry that Rob Youl was involved in 20 or 30 years ago, where there were major schemes in the 80s and 90s revegetating with Indigenous plants. The latest fad is let's fly in some advanced trees, crane them in, massive trees from Western Queensland, overseas, etc. And we're going to ameliorate the microclimate because we're all facing this heat scorch, urban heat sinks. And there's big tree companies making millions of dollars on this, and all our urban arborists and foresters are going to the same junkets where they're getting this, the perfect tree for climate change is going to be one from somewhere else. And that totally ignores all the work that's been done in the last 40 years by community groups, land care groups, etc., in restoring biodiversity and the environment. But when we start to think about regrowing wildlife habitat, we need to make the connection between the larger vertebrate wildlife we appreciate and what's happening with the system. So anything that produces biodiversity for invertebrates is what we need to be targeting. And the species of trees that may be adapted to climate change from somewhere else are not going to cut it for providing that basis of the food chain. Productive wetlands, we need to think about unpolluted water as a source for a whole lot of things happening. Healthy food webs, everything from the diatoms, the vascular plants that create oxygenated, aerobic soil, submerged soil zones, etc., which produces everything right up to the carnivorous invertebrates, the damselflies, the back swimmers, the dragonflies, etc., that you see in wetlands. And so if we need to think about the biodiversity that's with microbats, we've got to think about the productivity of even wetlands and how they monitored, how they cleaned, the gross pollutant traps, which have become a great environmental engineering feature of our treated urban runoff. They need quarterly inspection. Council needs to budget this. Council plans need to schedule it. They need to be inspected after every major storm, perhaps over every 25mm storm. And they need to be cleaned at minimum every 6 months before some of the things they trap, these are the traps, not the actual wetlands themselves, start breaking down to other deleterious compounds for the receiving waterways. So we need to see our constructed wetlands even as a living system which supports. But we also need to think about microclimate. So I'm right into those dense plantings, especially where prevailing winds, the cold southwesterlies, exposure to the winds from the bays, from the Antarctic, from the Southern Ocean that come into winter, and even those hot desiccating winds that are a feature, increasing feature of climate change of what we're facing. So we need to look at the energy balance of small mammals and look at our revegetation, continuity of good habitat, wildlife corridors, especially with climate change, very well extreme. So your work doesn't just end here. It happens throughout the municipality. It happens up and down the Elster Creek. It happens in connection with what's happening with coastal remnant vegetation, restored vegetation, the Greater Yarra, and so on, the Downhill Creek Valley, the other wetlands to the south, right up into the hills south of the Downhill Ranges, the hills south of Seaford, once you start getting Mount Eliza and the Peninsula proper, etc. So we need to be able to connect what we're doing with what's happening. There are some bat species that are a feature of caves and mine shafts. You probably won't get many of those around here, but bear in mind that sometimes other things that humans have created provide the occasional home for that fauna. There's specialist scientists and techniques that are involved in that. Some of the things like the small forest bat, one of the smaller species, the size of your thumb, it's eaten about 3 to 5 times its body weight insects per night. So that's what sort of precarious existence you need to cater for. And the Clarke hollows, that single men's quarter for a Google's wattle bat is a hollow too small for anything else to compete or be interested in. So in a major tree, this is a classic poster tree, 800-year-old red gum. It's not these big hollows and spouts full of possums and cockatoos, but a little tiny little split in the trunk down there where this bat is sitting. And of course, there's a whole lot of research scientists that can tell us more about these things. Some of the plump specimens in our region, you'd almost take to the Royal Agricultural Show and win a ribbon for them. And one of the things, back in the 80s, there were some people that did some work on nesting boxes in the 90s, and at La Trobe University, they found a number of different species that would use nesting boxes occasionally. That picture's changed. It's not a catch-all. So these days, there seems to be only one Gould's wattle bat that's consistently used and found in nesting boxes. So it seems like the natural bush and restoring the balance is going to be more important for those species. Other arboreal mammals, everything from koalas to possums, brush-tails, ring-tails, etc. Some of them are hollow-dependent, the koalas obviously aren't. But palatability, there's almost an agricultural concept we need to think about. The palatability of that feed for the herbivores ultimately determines the health of those populations. So the most fertile sites, of course, have been taken up in rural areas for agriculture. In urban areas, some of the floodplain areas, which we haven't been able to build on, the Ulster Creek floodplain in particular, represent sites with great fertility, and that means your revegetation and vegetation growth could be quite spectacular and quite fast. And it's those areas where we need to try and get the mix right, and doing so we're providing for the arboreal mammals fertile pick. But we don't need to think about just the herbivores, grazing animals. There's many dense middle-story nutritious shrubs, especially wattles, but also members of the pea family, which have been lost because of changes in land use, changes in fire regime, changes in grazing, changes in land use history. So we need to try and reintroduce those natural nitrogen fixes into the system. Nitrogen fixes are important. You know they have that symbiotic association with their roots, with various forms of bacteria, different in wattles and peas, different in the she oaks. So they are the organisms that take, the symbionts, that take atmospheric nitrogen, which is 72% of what's in this room between us, and turn it into organic forms of nitrogen. And these are the amino acids. So if you go back to your sort of nutritional science, we know the amino acids are the building blocks of protein. And so these insectivorous plants in the middle story, understory, are under constant attack and defence. There's been terms written by the entomologists like Professor Tenby from La Trobe about all these insect-plant interactions going on, particularly in the wattles, but also other members of the family. So we need to get those back into the system. Continuity of canopy is important for the arboreal mammals. Shelter belts and all those microclimatic challenges need to be addressed in our planning and revegetation and the wildlife corridors. Not just in quantity, but as Mike said, they need to be improving quality. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for, dominance of only those, successful bullies. So, even things like the gliders, the Kreft's gliders, previously known as sugar gliders, the species have been split up in three to tell us about a lot of timing. So the ones in this Melbourne area, Kreft's glider, Doris mutatus. We know that this, once you get your even in regenerated, revegetated bushland, gets to a certain age and density, you can successfully improve on that. And sometimes the type of hollows we're talking about, where sugar gliders and bats might occur in, are the ugliest trees that get the red X by your local council arbors. So they're not always the spectacular trees, but we need to recognise the value of even those breaking up, brittle, sort of decomposing trees. And probably very little weight in the canopy anyway, and probably no consequence to it anyway. So we need to rethink what constitutes habitat in our landscape, in our reserves. And again, wattles are the great attack all the time. That sap they produce, that healing process, is a food resource in its own right, not just towards large wildlife directly, but even to the invertebrates. So sometimes when you see sugar gliders or Kreft's gliders feeding, chewing on the sap of trees, they're getting that carbohydrate fix from the actual exudate, but they're also creating sometimes scars that they keep revisiting. And it's those scars where you often get aggregations of insects. So they're actually big carnivores, the gliders, particularly the things elsewhere outside of this area. Things like the yellow belly glider, big carnivores, squirrel gliders, etc. Sugar gliders, so on. So this is an area of artificial revegetated creek line, a channelized creek. And this photo taken in the 80s just showed, this was like Ringtail Central. So this is what a creek should be looking like, a riparian zone with its full complement of silver wattle, strong paper bark, tea trees, other things, an overstory of hughes come along. And I've been lucky enough to sort of live in an area where, following from Mike Clarke's sort of comments that they had gliders colonised all the way down here where he lives in Rosanna Parklands, from work that had been done at Latrobe and Greswell Forest. We even had a land care grant that, got the Westpac Bank to sort of install listing boxes, got them right up from Latrobe Sanctuary, right up to the habitat link to Greswell Forest. And then they used remnant wildlife corridors along the Rosanna Railway line and the Salt Creek to make it all the way to Rosanna Parkland where Mike lives. a nesting box is stuck. So I thought, geez, okay, I found an old nesting box, stuck it up in my place in the cloud on a 35-year-old yellow box. And lo and behold, last year, sugar gliders in the suburbs. So, poor photography. And then they glide over my house and my Hellenic wood roofs to the local ironbark, indigenous again to the region, Eucalyptus tricarpa. And from there to the other yellow box over my veggie patch. And over the neighbour's unit, that's my yellow box, into the nearest reserve. I'm sure this is going to work. No, it's not going to work. Getting too fancy, getting ahead of myself. I had a video of I'm gliding over the neighbour's unit. But certainly retaining the indigenous trees in planting cases. These are some trees that were going to be done away with, that multi-unit development in the 90s. Us local greenies took it all the way to AAT or VCAT as it's now known. We protected those yellow box. We've got the shape, the size and shape of those units changed. And we actually sort of, you know, they're the sort of things that's real urban forestry, keeping those trees and adding to that wildlife corridor in the rail line. There's a group of us that do the weeding and guerrilla revegetation down there. But the keystone species like the wild is very important. And for ground-level mammals, I won't spend much time there on these, but similar sort of principles apply. Shelter, variation in habitat, from density to clearings for some species, continuity of habitat, wildlife corridors, the shelter belts. And certainly what's happening with organic matter content soils, the composition of the understory, the fungi, the humic layer, and of course keeping the feral foxes under control, cats, dogs. Even the presence of dogs has been shown by researchers at Deakin can startle or scare certain things at great distances. But also what we often forget, it's not just a direct scaring or predation by our introduced pet dogs and cats. It's the contamination of the environment with parasite loads, scents, all those disturbances and disturbance. And I remember from parasitology in agricultural science, just about every parasite, top carnivores run a critical part of the life cycle of all these parasites. And our pet dogs and cats, and even our strays, are a big load on the environment. And they occur in the urban environment at densities like 10 to 100 times what carnivores occur in natural systems. So that's a lot of, you know, defecation and parasite load shedding and scent shedding, etc. in our environments. Really, if you're going to focus on biodiversity, you really need no-go zones with these introduced carnivores. And the moles, the seasonal work. A lot of the kangaroos that we see getting flushed out onto roads around Melbourne, it all happens in that pre-Christmas tidy-up. And everyone's mowing the easy bits. No one's doing the weed control of the difficult bits. So even where there are mammals coexisting in perhaps sustainable sized populations in some of our open space networks, they're being flushed out onto the roads due to some of the seasonal work we're doing. And sometimes we need to think about how we design our open space and our boundaries to open space, etc. And we need to start thinking about food sources such as invertebrates, woody debris as part of that sort of contribution to ground mammal. And some of the ground mammals you'll see around here, the wetland systems, need the same sort of protections. I want to get on to birds, which is what the focus of today's thing is. So I might stand over here, you can still see. So we need those flowering sources, the nectar stations, but we need to diversify the availability of supply across the year. And that's because some of the birds we might be wanting to provide for are only in our areas for part of the year. They may be moving through the landscape. So it's very important that we try and get on any site as many of the indigenous eucalypts that would have been in our greater region, recognising that we've now got sites that are artificially wetter and artificially drier or mounded. So we can cheat a bit. We're creating these de novo revegetation sites of biodiversity, and we can look further afield to our region, look towards Yarra Bend, the foothills of the Dandelions, the foothills south of Frankston, and get plans of those dry sites. We can look at the true riparian zones that survive in our area, and now that we've got permanent wet zones, because of the extra hard roofs, hard catchments, creating more peaks of runoff, these wet systems, we need to dominate those with the eucalypts that do well in those sites. But we need to look at the other large nectar productive plants, the Banksias, the Banksia marginata, the Spinulosa, the Hakeas, the bushy needlewoods, not just because of the nectar, but also because of the supplies, the wattles. I mentioned the value of them in the ecosystem. I'll reiterate that. The tea trees, the paperbarks, the bottle brushes, even some of the particular ones in the region may not have been on this site. Null yellow gum, Eucalyptus woodcock from the subspecies Canata, populations nearby at Yarra Bend, yellow box, particularly on higher ground, red box even. I found it sort of nearby at the Royal Talbot and places near, not that far from here. Not quite truly of this site, but we're dealing with a massive altered environment. But there's a problem with nectar alone. We're catering to the nectar junkies and the bullies. So we need to think about nectar plus protein. Restoration, good thick understory, prickly, spinescent shrubs, the needlewoods, hedge wattle. And there's a whole lot of other smaller ones as well. Acacia gymnasifolia, Acacia ulicifolia. There's a whole lot of these, even some prickly peas and so on. Sweet Bacceria for its spines, for its summer nectar. Some of the bottles, the tea trees, tree violet, the Melicitus, nocturnal aroma, pale flowers, catered for those nocturnal insects, produces small berries, which small fruit-eating birds will spread around, so they'll actually spread around, but also reptiles. So a lot of these fleshy fruit things fall to the ground. A lot of our skink fauna are not just strictly feeding on invertebrates, they're also feeding on fleshy fruit on the ground, and many of them ingest and disperse the seeds just like birds do, and sometimes enhance the germination rate as they pass through the gastrointestinal tract of a reptile, as we know, reptile, bird, cousins. Prickly currant bush, prickly Moses, one of the wattles which is quite good for its habitat. And more wetland habitat for birds, there's entire tomes written about that, we're seeing it in action here. But the diversity of wetland types and wetland vegetation, to thick reed beds, shallow ephemeral wetland meadows, bird baths in the home. I get some, last week my wife had a swift parrot in our bird bath on our balcony in McLeod. They're back. They're back about 3 weeks ago. Got to the Mornington Peninsula. So they do use even habitat in the Melbourne area as they move through to wherever they like. It seems to vary from year to year. We also need good creek banks, sandbanks, stable creek banks without the erosion, without the threats to those creek banks. Continuity of habitat, feeding economics is very important. The corridors. And the trees I've mentioned on artificial dry wet site, and climate change challenges and best choices. We need prominent perches, control of the cats, foxes, feral birds, which is what today's about. I won't go into that in detail. But there's an empirical logical sequence to restoration, based on reading the land, vegetation, land use history. Resting the land in phosphorus-rich areas, giving time for the phosphorus to end up in the phosphorus accumulator. So animals, whether they're invertebrate or us, we're walking bags of superphosphate. So there's a time in restoration, and so we need to recognise that resting the land, even dense thickets of introduced pasture grasses are being grazed sometimes by caterpillars and butterflies, sometimes beneath the ground by beetle larvae, etc. So we need to give time for that phosphorus, and we can do things that will accelerate the movement of that phosphorus into the invertebrates and thereby into the birds that disperse it and take it away. So that we're reversing agriculture or reversing turf management. So that, anyway, some artificial habitat constructions. Artificial wetlands. revegetation on the banks of wetlands. The tree guards have hardly been removed. And occasionally, you're catering for the common species, but occasionally you might succeed and get something rare in those rare years, like bitterns or whatever have turned up in constructed wetlands in the Melbourne region. We've even had, because of the magpie goose recovery program, we even had a magpie goose turn up in 1 year. But yeah, the sort of understory thickets I'm talking about, the artificial wetlands, the islands, the boundaries, the dense vegetation around wetlands, the appropriate water quality which creates an invertebrate life for those that sort of come into the perches. But just to prove the value of wetland plants, this is a swimming pool that was planted with wetland plants so that kids could do some educational activities in. And it became such a big hit with the birds, where to stop ducks landing on it. So someone rolled up this device there. It just shows you that even something as boring as a steep-sided swimming pool, with the right revegetation, can create water quality and food and macroinvertebrate assemblages that will attract birds. So, regrowing the wildlife habitat. A polluted water quality treatment pond edge, and you get crakes and rails on those exposed mudflats, feeding on the invertebrates and stuff that come up out of those. Some of our best weeding team, you get that habitat right for these fellas. They'll be out in the bare paddocks in winter, pulling up, everything from Rob Youl to shallow-rooted, introduced pasture grasses and turf grasses. Things that were absent in my early days in revegetation. Just a constant sort of build-up of the wattle seed bank through our tolerance and use of wattles in open space, bringing back birds like those dependent on, and black cockatoos. They were absent from Melbourne large areas where they came in to attack pine cones. But now they're back on the natural tucker in the wattles. Anyway, I'm getting the line up here, but perhaps just to sort of provide some inspiration, I'll just flick through some of the slides. Red-rumped parrots back on the salt bush. It's not just on poa-annua and main lawns. And certainly, we know there's important visitors. And another plug for the indigenous trees. I'm not going to take it from any urban forester that we've got to plant trees from somewhere else to cope with climate change. We have got tree species that will grow out of cliff faces in Melbourne. We've got shrubs that do the same. I think you're lacking imagination if you can't revegetate your municipality to narrow nature description car parks and even your bushland areas with species indigenous that are capable of the climate change challenges. This is the Melbourne yellowtail. And mowers and disturbance of ground level. You're not going to get any parlours and things if you're out there mowing everything, brush cutting and letting the animals and pets run around there. All right. Things on reptiles and frogs, but just to sort of show you some everything from small gardens to areas revegetated and lizard lounges and use of the debris, slabs of concrete, and revegetation for local species. Everything's in small spaces. All these things are revegetated, artificially restored areas.
And all your slides are local, aren't they?
Yeah, they're all from the local area. And the whole thing about insect biodiversity is very important. And even getting the parasitic insects and the predatory insects, the insects that prey on the other insects, etc. Very important. The butterfly plant flying associations and animal associations. The big keystone species like lightwood you know, flowering more prolifically in summer, flowering twice in that area, in spring and again in summer. The native grasses. And the keystone species. I just want to mention one more thing, sorry about going over time. The indigenous wattles, there was a study in the 70s at Latrobe Uni where Dr. Dether and Dr. Dan for short, and Tim Yu planted these plots, and he had a whole lot of wattles, pinnate and fly-load wattles, indigenous ones, and ones from New South Wales, longifolia, acacia currants, which is like a weed here, etc. They found the indigenous wattles, individual trees, had over 300 taxa of invertebrates on an individual tree. The pinnate ones were the winners, with black wattle and silver wattle having something like 700 taxa of invertebrates on individual trees in their plot. In contrast, the pinnate wattles from Sydney, acacia currants, less than 200 taxa. So that's what type of biodiversity contribution we're seeing in using, getting the invertebrate populations, the summer flowering Cassinias, right. And there's a whole story about controlling borers and nematode wasps, parasitic wasps, what happens on the bark. And yet we're still seeing, last year, our urban forest manager, municipality that I won't name, planting American tulip trees. Apart from this has been the wrong decision from climate change, more deciduous leaf fall into our gutters, into our stormwater system, into our wetlands, choking the oxygen of our streams for fishes and aquatic life. We've really got a long way to go. Whilst developers are being encouraged by someone else in the same department to put indigenous trees in the front of the units. And some councils are, and some people see that and think it's a disease. And that's actually biodiversity. It's just about all life on Earth depends on plants being eaten, primary produce being eaten by something else. There's one. Education value of natural areas. Thanks, Mike. I'll pay you for that one. Leave it at that.
He's lived here most of his life, and he's a wonderful, not just, I suppose the old term is field naturalist, but I like to think of him as, in many ways, a young David Attenborough. He's got a really big picture view of the ecology, and he's great company, and I think what George said is a pretty good sort of entree. He shares a lot of your views. That'd be right, isn't it?
That was my presentation up here. I'll just swap these over.
Did I mention that EPA, in little letters, not the more famous one, Elsternwick Park Association, is the community group, and Natalie is here, and she's the president. Just hands up. So how many members have we got, Natalie? And,
that's a good question. I think it's getting towards 200.
200. How's that?
But we've kind of been a little bit quiet because our old website's got a bit clunky, and we're just about to launch a new one, which will hopefully attract more of the community to join.
It's very good, isn't it? And a lot of young people too, like yourself.
A lot of young, but in that group, it's got again.
I beg pardon?
In that group, though, we've got it's just an incredible amount of active volunteers. So Bayside's been quite impressed that we're getting a whole range of people from all ages joining us. So. Yeah, but there's going to be room for many more to get involved over the next years, as you can, and you'll probably hear a bit more from Gio. There's lots to do. We basically need a green army to really get the master plan alive and tick off all these amazing things we've got to do.
If possible. And just before Gio starts, how many members? Who are the members here from EPA? I'm actually a member too. but you probably don't know it. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah.
And Jo, you were one of the founders, weren't you, of BPA? Yes.
Cool. So I'm going to just try to get as stuck in as possible to the practical remedy side of things. And to do that, I'll be sort of unravelling stories from various different reserves and other environments locally to look at how that interaction between noisy miners and all of those smaller birds that are disappearing, how those interactions play out in different environments, and hope that that gives us some clues to what we could do better. And to do that, I'll sort of be trying to see things from the miner's perspective and understand what makes habitats favourable or otherwise to them. So that photo was taken just downstream of here. That's a red-lined geometric moth caterpillar that it's about to feed to its young. And a lot of people say, you know, generally spiny plants are good as shelter for small birds, and sweet bursaria happens to be a spiny plant. It's actually the favourite nesting plant of noisy miners locally. So there's obviously some nuance there that hopefully we'll get to dig down into. This was a story that Jo shared. It illustrates the common pattern through a lot of our parks is that we've already lost a lot of our resident small birds, and even the migrants that are just trying to pass through the landscape, like this white-winged triller, end up, as Jo said, in a population sink. So not only are these green spaces not serving as habitat as they should, but they're actually going even further than that. So that's a really dire situation. If you had a car park there, the bird would be more likely to survive going across it. And that's something that we really need to fix. Basically, I've been looking at I've been looking at patterns of coexistence between noisy miners, habitat features, and small birds. And this just shows that for a time you can get an apparent coexistence. That orange line, and these are several years worth of monthly surveys, the orange line of white-plumed honeyeater numbers in Gasworks Park. Thankfully, and this was largely Rob and Judy's data, thankfully they happened to start before noisy miners became established. And I teased this out of their whole bird survey data, but you can see as the miners come along, there's only a barely noticeable shift in white-plumed honeyeaters, but eventually when things really kick off and the noisy miners start proliferating, the white-plumed honeyeaters just taper off, and they're now, I reckon you'd say, locally extinct in the park, would you? And I've seen the same thing happen at Elstonwick Park south, where I know birdwatchers who actually got inspired to birdwatch after seeing white-plumed honeyeater fighting with a noisy miner in Elstonwick Park South, and you can no longer see that happening there. So the coexistence is temporary. This is a little sample of some of the environments that I'll be sort of using to unravel this complex story. And I've surveyed lots and lots of different environments for small bush birds and noisy miners, and deliberately choosing both areas with and without noisy miners. So you can see there's a lot of really open habitats there, and people often think, oh, there's no small birds here because it's open. But you take the noisy miners out of the equation, and it doesn't matter. There'll be small birds there almost in any environment. Now this is sort of what I came to. It's a very simplified model, and it's similar to something that Michael put up actually, that anything sort of to the right of that line there is acceptable for noisy miners. So they need a combination of those features, and does that kind of make sense? Yeah, sure. So this is the zone where noisy miners are very happy. As you start to get a shift where you've got more coverage and quality of refuge, that then flows on to allow small birds to exist, and the noisy miners can no longer do well. So,
yeah, perhaps recite just the annotation there, sure. Each one, a bit hard to read.
Oh, no worries.
Sugary exudates down.
From low to high, left to right, sugary exudates. So that's nectar, but particularly, as Michael said, lerps as well are extremely important. And then coverage and quality of refuge. I think we need to think more about the quality, particularly in landscapes like this where we can't fully revegetate the whole landscape. We need to make sure that what we're putting in is as effective as possible. And then lawn, funnily enough, is locally at least, seems to be a really important feature determining where noisy miners exist. So looking at how this plays out in one park, this is the St Kilda Botanic Gardens, and I've split it into 3 parts because it's 3 distinct habitats from a miner's perspective. You've got the northern section, which is almost all introduced trees. No eucalypts at all in the northern half. Then you've got the southern half, which is dominated by eucalypts. So, you know, that's this sort of theoretical, but there's a drop in sugary exudates in that northern half. The structure and the amount of lawn is pretty much exactly the same. But because of that reduced eucalypt abundance, you see that the bird community in the northern half of the gardens is just 9.5% noisy miner, whereas it's a third noisy miner in the southern half. So trying to tease out those individual factors. And when I said structure, trees on lawn is exactly what noisy miners want, and particularly eucalypts have that very open and very defendable structure that allows noisy miners to exclude competition. And really seeing things from the perspective of miners, their entire life strategy revolves around their ability to exclude competition. They put a lot of energy into it, and obviously it's very, very important to them. So environments where they can't do that are not suitable. Now on from the sugary exudates, this is something that I noticed. So we disproportionately plant trees over other plant forms, and that's a structural advantage to the noisy miners, so we're forgetting all of the understory and ground layer complexity. Then disproportionately planting eucalypts, that's a resource advantage. And then something that I noticed a little while ago is that we actually disproportionately plant one subgenus of eucalyptus over another. And that's even though a lot of southeast Melbourne would have been dominated by stringy barks and peppermints, which are the subgenus Monocalyptus. I did a tally, and out of 50,000 planted eucalypts in southeast Melbourne, 49,962 were all Symposium. And it just so happens that this is the lerp abundance on Symposium, and that's on Monocalyptus. So we're massively advantaging noisy miners with that bias, again, unknowingly. Now, back to the Botanic Gardens. The third section, very distinct, is the northeast corner. And it's still introduced plants, but we've lost the lawn and we've gained understory structure. And it just so happens that that is the most important migration stepping stone for small bush birds in all of St Kilda. And it's the only place, as you can see, where small bush birds have been recorded in these surveys in the whole of the St Kilda Botanic Gardens. So it's starting to give us, you know, a piece-by-piece clue of what's determining these things. Problem is, only 2 species of small bush bird are in there most of the time. It's brown thornbills and white-browed scrub wrens. And if you sort of extrapolate that up, the Ripponlea estate is like a giant version of that northeast corner of the Botanic Gardens, and the bird community reflects that. So it's 0% noisy miner over 6 hectares. 51% of the bird community is under 60 grams. So that's something that you just don't see in most urban parks anymore. And quite a good number, 8 species under 60 grams. That's during migration periods. So there are about 5 resident species that do really well and breed there, and then there are a number that pass through. And that's how Ripponlea sort of factors into that idea. So much reduced sugary exudates because it's mostly introduced trees, very few eucalypts. In fact, there's only 1, I think, in the estate. The coverage and quality of refuge is reasonably good, and there's not much lawn. So that's where you end up, just shy of it supporting noisy miners. Now, these are the birds that are really common in there. We've got grey fantails. It's the only place locally where we have resident grey fantails anymore, and they breed in there every year. There are 3 of them. But at the moment, there's up to 16 passing through many of the Tasmanian race. Eastern spinebills, brown thornbills, white-browed scrub wrens and silver eyes, they're the sort of common bunch. But that's about as good as an environment like that can get. As I said, it's dominated by introduced plants. And as George covered really thoroughly, they're not producing the insects with anywhere near the abundance or diversity of indigenous plants. And so if you actually inspect what's going on here in the bird community, the silver eyes are there largely for the fruit of many introduced plants. The spinebills are there for the nectar of introduced plants. So that's a food web that's going straight from plant to bird rather than the most important link in any terrestrial food web, which is plant to insect and then to everything else. So you're not getting much of that there because the fantail catches insects in the air, and a lot of them are emanating from the water bodies and from the leaf litter, which is enriched by irrigation. The scrub wren, again, getting almost all of its food from the leaf litter. The brown thornbill is the only slight exception, but they take extremely small prey, and I suspect that there being more invertebrates emanating from the leaf litter, that might slightly moderate this effect of the introduced plants by that. So when you see something like a golden whistler passing through, very rarely see it actually get a meal. And when that's in a golden elm, that's in a non-indigenous but otherwise native willow myrtle. Finally, it lands in the only indigenous tree in the whole of Ripponlea Estate. It's a self-seeded black bottle, and it finds a meal. And when birds are stopping on migration, they're not resting, they're desperately refueling, and if we don't have insects in the landscape, it's not going to work. Now, I wonder if I can get this to play. Whoops. Let's see. I'm going to try to skip it forward, but it may not work. I'll try one more time if you'll bear with me. Yeah, it's just a bit. I was going to be skipping forward to the minute mark, but I'll see if that works. Because I can't see any like little controller. Anyway, maybe I'll just skip over that. But I was pointing out that you'll miss out on a bit of funny footage, but also noisy miners must be the only honey eater that brings earthworms back to their young, and they really are quite special in that they'll use lawns extensively. It's something that seems to be very, very important to them. They brought earthworms back to their young, and then one of the chicks put up a fecal sac, which is basically a little sack of poo that the parents then carry away to remove the smell from around the nest so that it doesn't attract predators. And it flew away with it and managed to drop it on the shoulder of a guy that was walking across the... You can't see the poo hit him, but you can see him go like that as the bird flies over, and then he picks up a stick and flips it off. Actually, anyway, so that love of lawn is another thing which can be isolated by looking at certain sites. And funnily enough, this is the best population of white-plumed honeyeaters left in the Secula area. They used to be the most common bird in parks. Now they're the car park honeyeater. This is the Belford Street car park. And it's got all of those requirements. So it's got a lot of sugary exudates. There's a lot of yellow gums in there. Very low quality and coverage of refuge, as you'd imagine, but no lawn. And so noisy miners just haven't thrived there. And that's really interesting. Obviously, I'm not advocating that we either plant more non-indigenous plants or that we pave the landscape for conservation purposes, but it just shows that all of these things have different influences. So now looking at a remnant site, this is George Street Reserve, which I've surveyed. It's the worst of all, which you wouldn't expect, but that says something interesting, doesn't it? Noisy miners wouldn't have touched heathland before. It's sort of the last habitat they would like. But literally zero species other than noisy miners reported there, at least in my recent surveys. And I might just read through this little excerpt quickly that so this is from 1994, a description of George Street Reserve. George Street Reserve also has an interesting and varied bird population. Resident birds include white-browed scrub wrens, brown thornbills, and many nesting spotted pardoilettes. So there's your scrub wren, brown thornbill, and spotted pardoilette. but the outstanding feature is the presence throughout the year of eastern yellow robins, which nested unsuccessfully in 1994. George Street is the only known current stronghold of the species in Bayside. In this reserve, the number and variety of birds increases greatly in autumn and winter with the advent of golden whistlers, grey shrike thrushes and eastern spinebills. The latter feed on coria, found mainly in the heathland part of the reserve. Shining bronze cuckoos may pass through while in spring, while pink robins and fuscus honeyeaters are rare winter visitors. So that's what's happened in a remnant site, and there's the coria still there. The habitat for all of those birds is still there. So the key thing that's changed is that noisy miners have moved in, and what's allowed them to do that in a habitat that they wouldn't have existed in before? It's partly a function of its size. It's extremely small, which makes it vulnerable to incursion, and also its proximity to lawn. And that's the Sandringham Golf Course, which is absolutely full of noisy miners, but you get them feeding all through the coast managums in the reserve over what is very dense heath. So it shows that those all-important features of Symphomyrtus eucalypts and lawn don't actually need to overlap in space. They can be near each other, and it can still spell the end for the bird community. So with that in mind, what are potential solutions? Well, this is a place that I found particularly instructive on that front. It's Cherry Lake in Altona, and everything on this side of the orange is full of noisy miners. Between the orange and the green is sort of a blend zone. It's a place where often there's a lot of battle. And then to the right of that green, the noisy miners just don't go there. And an even more stark boundary, or what's really exciting is the boundary is reversed here, the incursion is reversed, and this is Trimore and Tambour. I think we could learn a lot from this place in our design of minor discouraging parks. So 0.8% noisy minor, 72% of the bird community is under 60 grams, and that's getting up to the point that we like to see, and 7 species under 60 grams is pretty good. Now, a lot of people, when they're trying to figure out what's caused these bird declines, they look at introduced birds and try to blame them. But actually, what I've found with these surveys is those areas with the highest small bushbird diversity also have the highest percentage of introduced birds in that larger category too. So clearly, not really what's going on here. So you can see perfect noisy miner habitat, red gums over lawn, bordering on some different habitats here, which I'll dig right down into because I think it's critical. That's how it sort of shapes up. Extremely good quality of refuge. That's what really saves it. So you can see it's like many other parks in that it has a high portion of lawn and those Symphomyrtus eucalypts as well. And this is the critical element, I think, that's saved this place. It's a plant called tangled lignum, and basically the structure of it is like a giant ball of barbed wire. And there it is again, closer up. So I'll just skip back and say what I've observed here is that you know how I was talking about George Street, and Michael talked about remnants where you need to try to smooth out the edge because you've got this encroachment of up to 100 plus metres into many remnants from more open habitats. Well, I think what's happening here is the quality of that shelter is so high that birds just cannot be followed when they're escaping pursuit. And so the almost inevitable effect of that is that on a smaller scale, encroachment goes in the other direction, and it's small birds encroaching out into what looks like a perfect noisy miner habitat. This is sort of how I see it. So I've got examples of especially high quality structural refuge permitting coexistence with otherwise overwhelming threat. And I've got lots of examples of that happening for many often threatened species. And the interesting thing is often it's a sort of novel structural refuge that saves the day. So, for example, that study in the Mount Lofty Ranges found that southern brown bandicoots were 6 times more abundant in areas with blackberry. And that's because it was giving them a higher quality of shelter, refuge from foxes. Same goes for eastern barred bandicoots. Last place on the mainland where they were surviving in the wild was in car bodies and things like that in the Hamilton Tip, because again, the structural refuge allowed them to not sustain so many losses. Now, there's a lot of text here, but I'll just paraphrase it. Basically, different types of targets, as I'm calling them, everything that a noisy miner will chase, respond in different ways. And the higher the diversity and abundance, the harder it is for the noisy miners. There's a certain point where it has to become uneconomical for them to worry about chasing out competitors, because it's not going to bring back the benefits that they require and that justify that behaviour. And so when I say running competitors, that's spotted, striated pardalotes, white-plumed honeyeater. So they're things that are actually eating the same foods as the noisy miners. And when they're chased, they don't seek shelter. They actually just fly fast and often, up high and try to wear out their pursuers. And you'll see the noisy miners often in big streams of several miners following a pardalote across the sky in big twisting trajectories. And there's a point where often they'll give up and go back down, and I suppose that's the point where they calculate it's no longer worth their while, obviously. Then hiding competitors, again, often eating the same foods, but they require shelter. And then I've defined decoys. As Michael said, noisy miners will chase cans, so they'll chase anything whether or not it's going to benefit them. And that's where the decoy comes in, because really they're not competing with the noisy miners for food, but they're still wasting their energy in eliciting a pursuit. So mistletoe birds are a big one because and willy wagtail. And those sorts of birds are often the last to persist around noisy miners in urban habitats. So what you've got going on here, this is the lignum which rings Trinwar and Tambour, and essentially the red gums over the lawn are a no-fly zone for noisy miners, because, and of course this is just my interpretation, it is the case, but as to why, I think it's just that extremely high quality refuge means that all of those hiding competitors and decoys can basically just shoot quite easily away. New Holland honeyeater is one of those that will use shelter when pursued. And it's just like the noisy miners are just there almost playing whack-a-mole. They could be attacking one thing, it just disappears, and another one pops out, and it's just, these red gums are probably quite devoid of lerps for that reason, and it's just not worth it anymore. And that allows all of these other birds to sort of, the pressure's off, if you like, because it's more diffuse. I wonder if I can play this one. This was back when Elstonwick Park South still had flocks of pardalotes regularly in the winter. You can see how many lerps it's pulling off that leaf. That is extremely annoying for noisy miners. So not only it takes a lot of energy to chase these things around, but also they're using up that food source. So one of the worst enemies of noisy miners there. And as I said, willy wagtails are one of those running targets, and oftentimes in places like this, what some people call a lollipop park, you're left with just those. Sorry, face. You're left with just those species which can run and don't need to hide, but ultimately I think things end up collapsing when you don't have that broad base and diversity of different targets. That's what seems to happen anyway. This area borders on Trinwar and Tambour. It's the white skink habitat, and as you can see, the habitat's different again. This looks like lawn, but it's actually extremely rough, and it's just been slashed there. Usually it's about sort of knee-high or higher. It's full of weeds, mostly brassicas, which actually for an introduced plant have a lot of insect life in them. And there's fairy wrens making their way across. There are isolated hedge wattles, and also the trees that are there, often yellow box, quite young, and because they're separated from one another, very vigorous and very dense. So that's part of the story. Just over that ridge, there's the railway line, and that's a very distinct barrier. Over the other side, noisy miners prevail, and this was a fledgling collared sparrowhawk that flew. You can see they're bringing it down to the train line there, just as it crossed. So that's one of their main predators, as Michael said. But that's the power that they have. So this is the breakdown of the white skink habitat, and as you can see, have a look at those two. When I shift it, that's comparing it with Trin Moor and Tambour. So it's really just a switch of those. So very little lawn, but yeah, shift there in the refuge coverage. And this is also where I think it's sort of power in numbers that are overriding that lack of shelter, and this bird has a lot to do with that. So essentially the interesting thing about the white skink habitat in Trin Moor and Tambour is it's just a few little hectares in a sea of noisy miner heartland, which is 180 hectares of Royal Park, where they just dominate the entire thing, and it's a little sort of fort that has held up for years, very, very successfully. And you see birds getting bottlenecked. So I'm sure for a bird flying through the city, that big 180 hectares of green space looks great. They'll land in it and they get, I think, driven into this little corner. And that's certainly the case with many birds. But when it happens to things like mistletoe birds, they bring with them a great gift. And the white skink habitat probably has the densest population of creeping mistletoe anywhere in Melbourne. And mistletoes have been shown to be a keystone resource, particularly for birds in local woodlands. So with the removal of mistletoe in a study, there was a 34% crash in resident woodland bird diversity. So having mistletoes in the landscape is a great kind of trick up its sleeve. And there are still things there like grey shrike thrushes, which don't exist anywhere else in inner Melbourne, but they're there. And I think the mistletoes have a lot to do with that. The study that I mentioned found that the greatest influence of mistletoes is not on its birds that take insects from the leaf litter, and grey shrike thrushes are certainly one of those. And on that thing about power in numbers, when you've got abundant resources for these small birds and they're in a high enough abundance and diversity, they sort of get a lot more cocky. So this is a red gum at the back of my place, and we have resident brown thornbills, and they're usually in habitat like that. They stick to the low cover. When you get migrating grey fantails coming through and joining forces with the parvolotes up in the red gum, suddenly the brown thornbills occupy that entire large open-crowned red gum, which they never do at other times. So when you have more birds, especially those small birds, they sort of bounce off each other. Same thing happening here with a flame robin foregoing its usual ground existence and joining grey fantails in a flock up in a Moreton Bay pig. And these are the grey fantails at Ripponlea that are still doing so well. Yep, cool. So this is what bird communities should look like, at least according to my surveys. And those blue wedges are the proportion of birds over 60 grams in that bird community. So they're almost always the minority. And that doesn't matter what the habitat structure is like. The Western Treatment Plant in Werribee, this is looking at land birds specifically, but it's totally open. It's almost an agricultural landscape with a few scattered trees and a little bit of shrub cover in some places, but still dominated by small birds. Everything from warm temperate rainforest. Yeah, as you can see, that's the norm. This is what noisy miner areas look like, with more than a 10% fraction of noisy miner. That's the small bird population. The Bay Road Heathland Sanctuary looks like an outlier. It's got a sort of reasonably high coverage of tea trees, and essentially the small birds, the brown thornbills and the resident scrub wrens, two only resident small birds, have partitioned themselves from the noisy miners by almost never flying above 2 metres. So it's a desperate situation, even though it looks okay, because brown thornbills should be feeding up in the black wattles and other things that are at Bay Road, but they don't. As you can see, these are areas without noisy miners in urban areas, and you can see there's something else eroding the small bird populations. Although these are sort of the best performers, and without noisy miners, they've still got a lower proportion of small birds. Now, I think that introduced plants, like George said, have a lot to do with that. So this is a graph of caterpillar biomass in introduced first indigenous hedgerows, and a lot of small birds happen to be reliant on insects. So this is also showing a decline of birds in North America, and once you tease out those birds which are reliant on insects, they account for almost all of the decline. All the others have actually improved. So there's clearly that our landscape is hemorrhaging insects. It's because of things like this, just simple, seemingly mundane decisions like planting an ornamental pear tree or a plane tree or kikuyu grass and things like that, which are actually degrading our ecosystems on an enormous scale. And same goes for those non-indigenous eucalypts and other big nectar producers that we like to plant to bring in all of the most conspicuous birds. They're also exacerbating that by favouring the most aggressive. So I've got to echo what George was saying. Bipinnate wattles are just such massive insect producers, and I see them as sort of first aid for a situation like this in repairing insect declines and insectivorous bird declines. I won't go over too much of what he said. And Jawbone Reserve, gold standard. The amazing thing is we need to figure out ways that we can achieve a better situation while not changing the land uses, because we're working with urban parks where there are many, many uses, and some of those are just line of sight areas of sports and things like that. And if you look at Jawbone, it's about 90% lawn. There's scattered trees. It looks like there should be miners there. But the interesting thing is those trees are not eucalypts, they're she oaks. And you can't see, I don't know, you'd have to have very good eyes, but on the original photo you can actually see two bird species in a she oak and on the lawn, which are locally extinct in the whole of Bayside now. And 14 species under 60 grams. It's just a fantastic place. So finishing up, it is that good that you would need 6,454 hectares of Elstonwick Park Nature Reserve to equal the same small bird population on 6.7 hectares of Jawbone Reserve. So that partly goes to show the power of noisy miners, but also general habitat creation. But really, the habitat is not too different. So removing noisy miners can be seen as creating enormous areas of habitat from scratch that just aren't there at the moment. That's sort of how we should be looking at it. So yeah, nearly 1,000 times better than the Elstonwick Park Nature Reserve. And this is all of the parks in Melbourne that have been blacked out by noisy miners. So as those golf courses would have been fantastic habitat for a number of bird species, and green spaces would have been brilliant stepping stones. I'll just finish up and say that potentially the lack of sugar gliders could be having a small impact, but there are many cumulative things because they're something which feeds on lerps and may also predate noisy miners, which are a fairly small bird that nests surprisingly high, often higher than most birds their size. And I think sugar gliders lacking in the landscape maybe, even just fractionally exacerbating the problem, and we should do everything we can to restore balance, and they may be an important part of that. Yeah, that's really it. Beyond that, I was expecting to get stopped earlier, so it sort of loses its structure, but anyway, yeah, sure.
absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much, Gio. And Jacinta's got the interesting task of orchestrating the questions. There'll be a lot, and I guess you'll keep it sort of fairly fluid. You'll invite comments from our speakers, but I'm sure it's been good, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting.
Sum up what you think for a start, and then handle the questions. So
yeah,
we'll leave it to you. But
do we want to bring the speakers up to the front, maybe?
Probably that would be good, I think.
It'd be easier.
Yes, and I think after you, Jo will wind up. She'll be sort of looking at what's next. So we'll give you. We give you 20 minutes, and then Jo will wind up. Over to you. Jacinta is doing a PhD at La Trobe. What's your PhD in, please?
So my PhD is looking at the impacts of urbanisation on bird communities throughout Melbourne, but further north from here. I've been mainly working in the northern and eastern suburbs.
Well, one of these days we want live birds back.
That'd be lovely.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacinta. Thank you, speakers. It's been wonderful.
So some different strategies that we can be taking from here. So I thought I might kick off with a couple of questions and then we'll take some from the audience. I'm sure you guys have some as well. So the first thing that I thought I would pose to our panel, a couple of different speakers touched on planting guidelines and how introduced trees can be beneficial in some circumstances and detrimental in others, how that we're potentially bringing in a lot of non-Indigenous flowering plants like Banksias and bromeliads that are increasing nectar loads, that kind of thing. So I'd love to hear from everyone as to if you could change one thing about the planting guidelines within Bayside, within this park, within our own backyards, what would that be? Does anyone want to kick us off?
Yeah, go for it.
I'd like to blow the concept of the sterile plant out of the water. You know, a photosynthetic non-Indigenous tree that's not supporting insects is just one step better than a plastic plant.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think we too often see plants as sort of physical ornaments rather than interactive players within an ecosystem. And beyond that, we see our urban landscapes as separate from the natural world as well. So there's sort of that double effect, and it allows us to sort of get away with it without even thinking about what we're doing, even though it's enormously damaging. And you know, I think getting more plants like black bottles and drooping she oaks, that rather than being this sugar-based food web, you know, they're pumping out invertebrates, which is what we need more than ever. And yeah, that's going to service a wider variety of things than the usual focus on nectar, I think.
I've been really struck and learned a lot today about Gio's emphasis on structure and the refuge side of things and how close we plant. So not just what we plant, but how we plant it and whether it bushes up sufficiently to be a visual barrier to noisy miners detecting the bird in it. Yes, it's been really quite an eye-opener to me to go that next level, and I don't know whether Parks and Gardens staff, they trim other things, whether they could be encouraged to actually enhance thickness and structure of whatever they're planting. His story with the brown thornbills blew me away, that they're hanging on in the back of your place.
Can I just follow on from that, just in terms of the culling question, is that, like when you're saying in those areas where there's, you know, hardly any of the noisy miners, and so no one's going there and shooting them, that is purely, and in an urban situation, so that's purely being controlled by the design in a way. I mean, do you think that in this situation here, though, where you already have an infestation, that's where the culling's an important thing to establish, or, you know, get rid of them, and then build that structure, well, you know, because things take time to grow, it's not going to happen overnight. So I'm just throwing that out there, just what I've learned today.
As Michael pointed out, it's not entirely surprising that you get reinvasion, but it is really useful to see that you also, in the intervening period, can get an influx of the original small bird community. And I mean, if you change the habitat favourably and then use a cull as a catalyst for the shift, and then hope that those small birds, as was shown in examples like Trinwar and Tambur and white-skink habitat, hope that they can then maintain their own place more sustainably. I think that's probably got promise, but who knows?
A question for Gio, and that is, if you replace lawns with native grasslands, themeter and weeping grass, things like that, allowed to seed, that's going to be far less suitable for noisy miners, isn't it?
Yeah, probably, and Michael will be able to talk even more, I reckon. I did see a study that found that 5 centimetre long lawn was a bit of a threshold where it was less attractive after that point. But yeah, certainly roughing up the ground, as you saw at the white-skink habitat, they just don't really like to use it. And also having more insect resources in the lawns, I think, is going to bolster the small bird populations in general. So kikuyu provides almost nothing. I've seen common brown butterflies laying their eggs on it, but then the caterpillars don't survive. So that's an ecological trap. Whereas when you've got seed production and insects becoming abundant, yes, the noisy miners will benefit off that, but more so what's going on at Jawbone, where you've got lots of ribwort, plantain and other herbs growing among the grasses on quite rough ground. There's an enormous amount of caterpillars, and you get superb fairy wrens and yellow-rumped thornbills and things just covering those lawns in such abundance that it would be, noisy miners would have a hard time chasing them all away.
So part of a response to...
Yeah, the structure and also the output, yeah, I reckon.
On the topic of lawn, we've heard a bit today about how that's potentially creating a lovely space for species. It isn't just in our parks, it's also out front of our houses a lot of the time. It's on our nature strips. So do you see nature strips as being a bit of an opportunity as well? Because obviously this area isn't just isolated, we're completely surrounded by other potential habitat that can be used by noisies. So should we be targeting that as well?
I think so, yeah. Open lawns anywhere near eucalypts are just a door wide open. So as you know, some of the car parks showed, even just paving over lawn. Obviously that's a last resort. But yeah, no, totally. But I do think that even little patches, nature strips, possibly help noisy miners to make it into residential areas where often they don't do as well as in parks. Yeah.
And one thing I've noticed, and this is the agronomy background, I've seen a change in the fleet of mowing equipment, how mowing is done, how it's outsourced, how it's contracted, what the contract says. So that whole thing about mowing height doesn't just affect the quality of the habitat, it has other effects, like in a desiccating environment, the equipment of yesteryear, or putting your own lawnmower for your front lawn or nature strip to the highest setting, creates, reduces wind velocity at soil surface. So your desiccation of the soil layer, the humic layer, changes. So in a drought-prone environment, the impacts on soil biodiversity, humic layer organic matter replenishment, and the invertebrate biodiversity of even that soil profile, and green the lawns in summer simply by backing off on the mowing height all year round, even when you do have a lawn. You'll get a thicker lawn, you'll get healthier soil, you'll probably have better invertebrate communities as well. And people don't realise how much that's shifted, especially with outsourcing with compulsory competitive tendering in a certain political era in Victoria, and the writing of these formal contracts. And the fleet of equipment, those front turf mowers, are now being used everywhere instead of variable height slashes.
If we think a bit more about one of the potential management actions here around culling, Ian gave us some really great examples of culling of native species in various mammals and also some introduced species as well. This is always going to be a contentious issue because they are native. They're not, they haven't been introduced to this country. So how do we get people on side? How do we convince them that this is a worthwhile thing to do, even though we're going to go out there and potentially shoot a bunch of birds?
Well, I think first off, you've got to have a method that can be demonstrated to be humane. That's the first key hurdle. Not so much hurdle because we know how to do it. Secondly, some of Gio's data on on what noisy miners do and what you can have without noisy miners, or with very, very, very low numbers of noisy miners, plus all the other birds. That should persuade a lot of people, I think.
Can I add to that? You touched on the emotive bit, and I don't think we should be too precious about pushing the emotive button. Gio's got some footage of a stuffed pardalote being torn limb to limb. It's pretty hard not to be moved by that and to use that pretty openly, because the average punter, they're just two dicky birds and they've got no idea what a pardalote is, and there's all this other thing, and you're telling me that one's native and that one's native, and oh, heavens above, why should we take sides? But actually when they talk about things going extinct, and we used to have blue wrens and everyone loves blue wrens, that's criticising blue wrens or killing blue wrens is like killing motherhood. That's not, it's un-Australian. So I'd really be using those images because they're so powerful to sort of say, no, this is different to Indian miners. Yes, it is a native, and we have tipped the balance. They are just doing what they do naturally, and yes, you could do nothing, and that is a decision we could all take together and say, I can't come at killing anything. But if we do nothing, this is what we lose, folks. This is what we'll lose. And yeah, I guess I don't know that we've had the courage to have those conversations yet, very maturely in Australia yet. So I'd be going and pushing the footage pretty hard, actually. I guess I'm convinced the situation is desperate. And when Gio's, and I hate to be really pessimistic, but Gio's shown us pictures of reserves with no miners yet. So I'm really keen for your EPA to keep monitoring those sites and be very proactive at the first sign of an incursion, because my experience of noisy miner behaviour is coterie shift, and if they get big enough, they'll upscale their real estate and just come in as a coterie, not one little noisy miner at a time. They might have a foray party beforehand, but then the whole coterie will turn up and beat the living daylights out of everything that's in that site. That's how it works.
I think with publicity too, you need simple, hard-hitting messages, a bit of emotive footage, like the payload getting hammered, and emphasise that we've enabled these thugs to become thugs. All these birds to become thugs because of what we've done. We need to fix it.
Yeah, I really like that message that, you know, as Mike was saying, you make a mess, you've got to clean it up.
Exactly.
And this is very much a mess that we started.
And I might add as well. Oh, sorry, go.
No, I was just going to say, I hesitate to suggest videos of them chasing my dog. But I want to ask Michael whether he had any pushback from the culling in his experiments.
No, we didn't. We've only done it in rural landscapes, and that was very, very different, where there's a familiarity with needing to kill feral pests or whatever. I think it would be very different in an urban landscape.
Question more to Mike. What is a noisy miner control industry start to look like? You know, to actually roll it out. I mean, we've got vertebrate pest companies, we control bush regeneration, you know, happening on a scale, service providers. What does it start to look like?
I think Ian's better equipped. He will have people who control corellas and similar things like that in the past, or it's just mostly landholders taking it in their own hands.
The latter, I've just done a corella strategy for Del, and in that I've emphasised that killing corellas is not the answer. It can be part of a control strategy or scaring strategy. You need to do a bit of shooting so that birds know noise means danger, but the emphasis should always be, in other situations, living with the wildlife. In this case, we need to modify things so that the other birds can live with a habitat where we've enabled noisy miners. But I think we're going to have to accept that shooting is probably not going to be acceptable in a rural area for a number of reasons. You have to get public place permit from the police anyway, but that's unlikely to be forthcoming. It would cause enormous concern in some people. So I think you're going to have to be mist netting.
Yeah, if it's mist netting or cage traps, I think we've yet to develop, and I think we need some clever research into cage traps for noisy miners. Well, we were talking about this earlier. What we do know is that noisy miners are really good at recognising a foreign noisy miner, and I don't know how they do it, they are individual recognisers. So if somebody comes in from outside, they all chase that intruder. If you had a decoy in a trap, I suspect it'd be quite powerful.
Aggressive maggies are trapped that way.
Yeah, so I think we've got things to learn and do in that space. I do take up George's point. The scale of the problem is large enough that it could be an industry in Eastern Australia. If you were a capable, registered, humane disposer of noisy miners, there's a number of people that I've spoken to who would employ them and say, look, I don't really have the stomach for it myself, but I'm very willing to get rid of my noisy miners if someone would do it for me.
As long as you've got an efficient technique.
If you've got an efficient technique and a humane technique, and I think there's, Cindy might get on, I think it's massive to learn from the Indian miner experiences.
I'd imagine also it would have to be married with the change in habitat.
Absolutely, you can't just do this because you hate noisy miners.
Well, like we're not just killing them and that's our modus operandi. We're doing it within the context of ecological,
And that's part of your message to the public too.
Yeah, and I think the cloudiness that comes from them being native and that confusing people as to why you might want to cull them can be cleared up by thinking of it as, well, you never cull, well, I mean, it is often justified that way, but it shouldn't be. You're never culling things because they're bad animals or because they're mean or annoying or anything like that. The reason should be that because they've been ecologically released. And that happens when animals are brought from other parts of the world, and released from all of their, controlling context. But it can also happen when the environmental context has been changed around an animal. And that's what's happened with noisy miners. And so that's why a native species can be behaving in a way that we would usually associate with introduced. And so we should be treating it the same because the impacts are the same.
Well, same with kangaroos, we've removed the predators.
Exactly.
So we release them that way.
Yeah.
There's a question.
I was just about creating the habitats. So obviously, like the current spaces that we have and that we've created, the sort of savanna landscapes with grasslands and parks, it's very aesthetic to the community as well. And also for governments to make parks and councils and stuff, they all make this and it is the aesthetic. And even in suburbs where plane trees and introduced species, that's the aesthetic. What do you think is the best way to go about this to create these environments that are going to be accepted by the community, but also the councils as being aesthetic? And what's the best way to get it accepted by the whole community? Because it's not there currently, and the native plantings and the habitat isn't being created.
I think education, because your appreciation of an environment's aesthetic comes from a background knowledge of that environment, and when you have a very base level, or sort of you're ecologically illiterate, you see a plastic plant as just as beautiful as a live one, but a lot of people have enough ecological literacy to not see it as beautiful purely because it's plastic. And so we've got to advance that to understanding that introduced plants are only one step up from being plastic, and they don't fit into the ecosystem. And I think, also purely from an aesthetic perspective, being in a living landscape brings with it all sorts of aesthetic and spiritual benefits that we don't know we're missing out on until we see it, I think.
But another part of that is that you can retain a lot of that aesthetic simply by replacing your introduced grasses with native grasses that you allow to grow a bit higher. Becomes less suitable for the noisy miners, more suitable for a lot of the other, well, certainly insects and a lot of the small insectivorous birds. But you're retaining that look where that's desired. I mean, ideally you plant dense understory cover as well, but you don't have to do away with that aesthetic entirely. Just change the composition to some extent.
I'd just add too that we don't have many good exemplars around Melbourne. We stuffed it up so rapidly when we arrived. that becomes the accepted aesthetic. What I love about what George has been involved in at La Trobe is 50 years of dedication from a cow paddock to this incredible bushland reserve. No one in their right mind would have thought that aesthetic was even possible before that. And so it's, I guess it's pitching, in my mind, what Melbourne could look like and changing the goalposts a bit and saying, this is fantastic. It looks a bit untidy, but get used to it because it's just full of butterflies and all sorts of other stuff. So it's, yeah, I think, I'm hoping it'll snowball like the native gardens did in the 1970s, where we all started to plant natives. That you say, oh, this is kind of cool, and it's got blossoms and it's got lizards.
And look at the birds that are coming.
Yeah, look at the birds that are coming in. I think we need to showcase those visionary projects, and this is a visionary project, make no mistake. I'm hoping this is contagious up all Eastern Australia, what you're doing here. Not anti-golf, but it's a great move.
We might go to a question.
Just following up on Gio's call for education, which I support fully. I'm just a bit concerned with the direction of some of what we're talking about, where the resources are going to come from. But I'd just like to focus on a couple of what I think are really serious gaps. One is in our training. Having myself done a diploma in landscape design, the word ecology, the concept of an ecological benefit in landscape design, never ever mentioned, not in the unit of competence, not in the assessment criteria, just absent. Our local council's tree policy, no mention of ecology, of ecological value. Trees are valued for their aesthetic benefit and their shade, not for their ecological. It's absent. The word is not there, not mentioned. There are these gaps which are glaringly obvious and need to be addressed, and they impact. We're looking at an island in a sea of residential area. We need to get the residential side of things working in the same direction.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I have to speak to that.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, Bayside just passed an urban forest strategy, and
yes,
front and centre of the vision is that it's a living ecosystem.
And it's about biodiversity.
And oh my
That's
God,
excellent, but it hasn't flowed through to the tree policy.
But I cannot say, I think it would be inaccurate to say our current urban forest strategy does not have ecosystems at the heart of it.
That's fine.
And boy, it took a lot to get it in there.
Very pleased to see that.
We fought long and hard to get that at the heart of that
But
policy.
there are gaps, and they're important gaps.
But I think for me, what struck me was, oh my God, we had to, I'm a councillor. It should have been easy to get this as part of the urban forest strategy. I would have thought it would have come up from, the officers and just be a no-brainer. But to have habitat front and centre, to have ecosystems front and centre, to have ecosystem thinking as front and centre, and to understand that Indigenous plants and middle story and understory are absolutely key. It wasn't obvious, and it took a battle from within council to do it. And if we, because it's not just me, had done nothing, we would be planting hundreds of thousands of trees, but the wrong trees. And we wouldn't have the understory. We had to fight long and hard to get understory as a target. Understory, those complex structures in there. And that's the kind of thing I think we'll need to see all over the eastern seaboard. Eastern Australia, if we're going to have a hope in hell of maintaining our small bird species.
Getting back to the training question, our VET system, our TAFE system, is geared to having input from industry. That's what drives a lot of what the content is. To me, the problem with this particular industry, the landscape management industry, is, and councils probably are a little bit tempted to do the same sort of thing. It's all about efficiency, cost effectiveness, minimal cost, and I think that's partly why you're seeing the lollipop parks. Why is not the ecological need being added in, as well as this kind of, economic driver from the industry, because it's about the outcomes. I think that's another role of councils, to put themselves in and say, we are part of the industry, we need to have a voice, and here's an outcome that we want to see achieved. Build that into your training. I had a personal experience. Someone was talking about managing to save a tree, which, fantastic. I saved a tree in my neighbourhood. It was a 70-year-old. It was an exotic tree. It's a pin oak. However, it had 3 very large mistletoes in the top of it. And I wrote that to the council as part of my reason for saving it. It's got, it should, if we were using the iTree valuation system, we should count a quarter of it as being Indigenous, because it is in fact a quarter of an Indigenous tree. Council, through the planning process, it eventually got saved, but the first thing the developer did was send in the pruners and they took out the mistletoes. The arborists say, oh, but we were taught you've got to get rid of mistletoes.
It's all about tree health.
Yeah. There's a real gap in this training process and in the voice of the ecosystems getting into that.
And even in innovative projects like this, it's still a struggle to keep pushing for the ecological outcome. And that's a constant thing, because aesthetics, or an idea of aesthetics, can often still trump. So we're in a sort of a cultural shift. It's pretty slow, but it is happening, and it's recognised. And I think it's just an ongoing. And I think education is key. You're right, and also bringing industry so that the practices just become normal.
We'll have to wind up fairly soon. There's at least 3 people have had their hands up a long time.
Yeah, I might go to you in the back. Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether anyone's looked at reproductive control in terms of just being another weapon in the armoury against noisy miners. Not in isolation, but as part of the strategy.
Unofficially, I've tried putting a bit of linseed on noisy miner nests and then brushed out possums, find them and eat the eggs. That's had some success. That's it.
Well, I think the practicality, I don't know if you're talking about egg oiling or what you mean, but I think the practicality of getting to enough nests is just logistically very, very difficult. It would be very hard to have a population level effect by that sort of means. I think the best reproductive control is to kill the breeders.
Yeah, I mean, I like Gio's idea about changing the perception of non-indigenous plants and all that. And I think we could go further in terms of changing the perception. Changing the perception of recreational value of natural landscapes. Like you say, it looks a bit untidy or whatever, but people do enjoy being in a park and there's heaps of birds around. Whereas, I mean, we had these discussions at council when it was about what goes there, and people would say, well, why when if we've got a footy field there, you can walk your dog like if you're not playing, right? So it's not quite the same if you're walking in a park where there's abundance of bird. I think that'd be a strong selling point. Say well, if we want to have that, then we have to do all these things, right?
I think I heard, I hope I get it right, that there was a study that found that being in an environment where you're among 14 extra bird species is the same as a 10% salary rise in terms of happiness. So we can all see it that way. The noisy miners are stealing our money.
Aware of it, and that's what I think, where this learned idea of like what environment has to look at, what the aesthetic is, and say, well, how about this, right? And they're not aware of it. You just got to present it to them.
All right, might be second last question.
I was wondering, to get back to that Alison Park particular case, summing up from what we've heard today, it seems to me, and my takeaway from it is, what we should do out here is plant some liquid, don't mow the grass too much, put in some wattle trees, and see what happens. Because certainly that's what another very good park without noisy miners is Westgate Park, which has got the grass. There's lots of open lawns, but the grass is longer, it isn't mowed. There's lots of wattle trees there, and there's lignin patches, and it has got no noisy miners and lots of other small birds.
Yeah, Westgate noisy miner incursion reasonably well. So anyway, we'll see what happens in the future. But the surveys there, I think it's 83% small bird on average, and yes, there are patches of lawn, but the vast majority of Westgate Park is mulched, and also there's reasonably good understory. It's dominated by Symphomyrtus eucalypts, but has a very healthy population of both white-plumed honeyeaters and new horn honeyeaters, which are like the guard dogs of that place. So to the point where they're reducing, things like brown hornbills are extremely uncommon there. But certainly that can be improved over time.
Could I just add to that about Westgate Park? I was thinking of doing a question, but yeah, anyway, I'll be very brief. It's very well structured, and remember, just in the 90s it was almost a bare site. It's a site that's been created by volunteers, and they've done it in the right way using indigenous plants. But what as Mark's already mentioned, there's no trees on lawn, and the beds all seem to have a bit of an edge, and the trees are back a bit. So you've got this dense edge of vegetation, and then the trees are further back. The noisy miners find it pretty uninhabitable, but they are working on the edges. Across Todd Road there's a big population and they pressure in, but the park's resisting them well. And what I do sometimes find in the surveys is the odd birds coming inside, they're scouts, and they are checking the site out, but they seem to withdraw again, and that's still been going on, and I can see this through the years of surveys, but how long will it resist? But at the moment it's a fantastic population centre of fairy wrens and white-plumed honeyeaters and New Holland honeyeaters, and hopefully it'll stay that way.
That's really good point, to think about the edge in both dimensions, rather than just the edge in terms of the perimeter of a reserve or something. It's also the defendability of a tree that has this open canopy and then nothing underneath it. It's easy to defend, but when you've got that gradual slope, that does seem to make a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And by preferentially planting that sort of the grading of understory around established eucalypts, I think that would have an impact. At the same time, it would reduce habitat for certain things which need high perches and need to view the ground, like boorbooks and kookaburras. But you could say preferentially work on trees that are living and leave dead trees that are going to offer no resources to noisy miners without understory clogging up the, and in that way try to get the most out of the habitat.
All right, very, very last question. I'm going to go to you.
What are we actually permit for permission to cull noisy miners? Because my expertise is with culling the very successful Bayside Council program of culling Indian miners. And we've got lots of RSPCA recognised. It's the main way of doing it. It's carbon dioxide gas. It takes about 10 to 15 seconds for the birds to just calm and go to sleep. And where are we at with permission to actually do that?
Yeah.
So currently you require a wildlife destruction permit from the Department of Land, Water and Planning, DEL.
How hard is that to get?
How hard is that to get? Last year there were 12 issued. I looked up the website because it's reported every year. Last year 12 permits were issued and 2,000 noisy miners were killed last year under a permit.
Authorised to be.
Sorry, authorised to be killed, yeah. So they are being issued. You can guarantee they'll be asking for explanation of what's your habitat management strategy that accompanies the request that you're making. So if it's just your backyard, I suspect you wouldn't get one. But if you were part of the program, I would have thought to be sympathetically received, especially when it's a listed threatening process in the state of Victoria. So the mechanisms exist.
I used to manage that system, so I know a bit about it. And I think as long as you can provide a compelling case for why you're doing it and that it's part of ongoing habitat development, which will reduce the need in future, you should have a very good chance.
I might speak to that if I can, because in my role as Bayside City Councillor, I spoke with Delp recently about whether or not we'd be able to obtain a permit. And look, my jaw dropped, to be frank, with the hurdles that they were presenting to us. Really, what they were wanting us to spend many thousands of dollars on, a wildlife management or a noisy miner management plan. We had to prove that we had done everything possible from a habitat restoration perspective, and that included having put into effect a habitat linkage strategy. So we basically came away thinking we would not succeed in obtaining a permit now. Now, we may be wrong, but that was part of why Bayside City Council voted unanimously to put in a submission to the review of the Wildlife Act, Protection Act. It was written in 1975 and is currently under review. I think the draft new legislation will be out in early 2022, which is now. And what we are hoping is, or what we're going to be recommending, and I'm interested in anyone who wants to work with us on this, is that noisy miners might be considered in that review of the Act, and that they might be acknowledged as a threatening process, and that be considered in then if and when permits are required. Because what I would like to see is that we would be able to cull them, and that it would be a decision of the land manager, and that of course it would be done humanely. But even in places like Westgate Park, if they started to come in, that it might not be an impossible task for a group such as what was called the Friends of Westgate Park to be able to do a small cull to keep them out as part of an entire strategy, so that the bar was not this high, and that it was possible for local groups and local councils to be able to even consider actively managing them.
There is a fairly simple mechanism for doing that. It doesn't require amendments of the Act, and that's a governing council order that declares them to be unprotected under certain circumstances, and it might allow certain groups of people, for example, committees of management or Friends of Prospect Park, or EPA rather, to cull them as part of a management plan. And that sort of GIC order has been done for Womble, Gorillas, Galahs and soft-nosed cockatoos under certain circumstances, and that means that landholders who are suffering what they like to think might be severe damage by the birds can shoot them without problem. There's no scrutiny, but so, as soon as that provision is put there, you don't need a permit. You can just do it as long as you fit the criteria. So that's a simple mechanism for doing it.
Would you foresee that would be possible in a situation like this where there aren't necessarily populations of threatened species that are being affected? Would you see that as a barrier?
Not necessarily. It depends how the order is worded. But if it was to protect biodiversity, you don't have to have threatened species then. But if you want your whole suite of insects and insect-eating birds back, you need to control your noisy miners. And I think it can be a fairly easy justification.
All right, we might finish it up there.
Yes, thanks. Terrific effort. You said that it's one thing. Someone from the department was to attend today. Have we got a DWVLP rep here? No, apparently not. Just said that it was terrific, and I'm sorry for the people who haven't had a chance to get their questions, so we could go on longer. But we want to hand over to Jo now, who'll pick up a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes just to say where to next. And I think we've sort of got some indications from the discussion so far. So thanks for coordinating that, Jacinta, and thanks to the questioners. If you still need to, you could, over lunch, you can approach people. And well done to the the common minor group, that's a really useful precedent, isn't it, for EPA and for the council to consider your experience. Thanks.
I want to say very much a great thank you to an amazing array of speakers. Firstly, Michael Clarke, thank you very much for explaining to us so much about these intriguing birds, how social they are, how aggressive, how adaptable they are, and what a significant threat to biodiversity they present. And I think it's a really important concept. It's our mess and it's our responsibility to clean it up, and that culling as well as habitat management can work. And I think I'd be, and we would be really interested to work with you into the future to see what we can do and use this site as a start, as an inspiration for what we can do across Australia. And thank you to Ian. Ethics, it's complex. And I think you really highlighted how emotion and culture can actually override what might be clear thinking in this space. And also you brought up the ethical, what's the word? The dreadful situation with second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides and how incredibly unethical they are. And I, again, would be very interested to talk to you. Bayside voted unanimously a few weeks ago to phase out the use of second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. And not just that, we're going to be writing to every council in Australia, asking them to join us. And we're taking it to the Australian Local Government Association in June to allocate to the federal government to have them prohibited across Australia. So anyone here who would like to work with Bayside City Council on that between now and June, I'm really keen to see if we can get those terrible anticoagulants prohibited. So let's see how we go. It's a challenge. So George, I love your term regrowing wildlife habitat, because that's exactly what almost, I'm guessing, all of us in this room are absolutely passionate about. And also you spoke beautifully about other grey mammals that we hardly ever see in microbats. I loved your term wildlife meadows. And one of the things I'm most excited about, as I think Gio is and many of us here, is our plan to create a wildlife meadow in a conservation island away from disturbance. Right over there, the island is going to be 1 hectare, and I'm hoping about a third of that might be wetland meadows. So shallow, flat areas where I'm hoping the Latham skunk, the Japanese skunk, can actually feed in summer. So great term and beautiful slides. Also, carnivores, the cats and dogs. I think you mentioned 100 times the density of the natural population, and we certainly see that. And Bayside City Council is hoping, actually, it's out for public consultation to have 24-hour cat containment. Very unpopular, but potentially very effective policy. So we'll see how we go.
Very popular.
Very unpopular for some people. I think part of it is it's actually the cats that don't get killed by cars and dogs. And then Gio, you have been such an amazing inspiration and continue to be for so many of us. I've got these books at home, how to attract birds to your garden. Nectar, 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 sugar, sugar, sugar. And oh my God, we've really had to turn that completely upside down. I think I'm going to have to pull out all of the grevilleas and the flowering buds and start over again. And I think for many of us, it's, where to from here, and I'm going to get to it, is we really have to do a transformation of the way we think, how we educate, and maybe Harry's studying landscape architecture. Maybe one day you'll be the chair of landscape architecture. I don't know. In your university, and we will just have to redesign the way we educate, the way we think, so that we've actually turned this all on our head so that ecology is first, so that we understand that insects are the core of our ecosystem and that landscapes are about ecosystems. And I think, Natalie, you said to me the other day, part of the aesthetic, part of the beauty of this place is actually the birds. Oh my God, how beautiful it is to have such a beautiful bird forest in the morning. And Tanya, you know that the birds, the butterflies, the little, now they're like helicopters, damselflies and dragonflies. That's the kind of aesthetic that I think we can move towards. And Gio, I think you've really studied noisy miners and you've shown us 3 key factors: the lawn, also that quality refuge. I'm really interested in seeing if, perhaps combined with culling, if we can really create quality refuge structures here, whether we could potentially bring small birds back. And I think what I'm hoping is if we can do that, we might be able to start what I'm calling, there's probably a better name, but the Elswing Park Nature Reserve rollout across Australia. And maybe we can do it. Maybe that's if we can look at this over the next 50 years, what we could achieve. And I think also you spoke about, for me, what was a heart-wrenching tale of what was a George Street Reserve and then what is there now. Maybe, just maybe, we could turn that around. Maybe we could look at, if we could start with a culling, it would have to be trialled here. If then we could look at George Street, what could we do there to bring all of those small birds back? So I'd like to hand over to not so much look for questions, but more ideas of where to from here. One of my first is I'd like to be able to see if we could put in a submission to the draft Wildlife Act as a start, and that will be a very concrete action that Bayside will be taking in the next few months. And if anyone would like to join us, please, it's going to be talk to me. I throw that out as one concrete action. Are there any other concrete actions, any other partnerships? So any ideas? I'll let you go.
So I would suggest that in addition to your advocating for amendment to the Act, also mention something that GIC might be another way around, because they mightn't think of that.
Thank you.
Joe, look, it hasn't been mentioned, but I mean, within a year, Bayside Council will inherit 4 hectares of degraded grass and woodland and hires, and that might be capable of natural restoration to the sorts of habitat structures that are needed to reduce noisy miners. And I'd just like you to keep in mind as a possible site for experimentation on those noisy miners, culling, making them unpopular and so on.
Michael, are they in the high grassy woodland conservation area?
No, noisy miners, yes, they are at present because it's been.
So that could be another site.
Sorry?
So that could be another site that we could look at.
Yeah, I mean, it was mown, but I mean, talking about a totally different sort of ground layer and understory as the restoration procedure.
Got the old gas works, is it?
No, it's the old CSRO.
Oh.
It's got yellow box and river ends.
Rosie?
I think that it could be really beneficial for Bayside to have an education campaign within the council staff around the importance and the contractors they use, around the importance of things like this really prickly dense understory, which all of us will talk about today. Because I think that sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between ecological advice
cooperating with the Eco Centre, I assume?
Bayside.
Yeah.
We may well be.
Well,
Yes.
well, the art is cool. Oh, that's right.
Yes.
An action that I'm going to take away is try to work out who you talk to in landscape architecture and training to infiltrate an education system I'm unfamiliar with. I train ecologists, not landscape architects, so yeah, something to follow up.
We need to invite Greg Moore here, and I know he's interested, so we'll try and get him back here, and Rob Saunders might be interested in coming along. But let's keep Greg in mind, because he was quite enthusiastic to go visit.
The landscape architects did that wonderful report on staff of grasslands about managing the grasslands in the west of Melbourne, and there's some contacts there in future.
I just wanted to add that just from the Alison Park Association perspective, I really want to ensure that we can continue using you all as a brains trust. And also then as everything's sort of in process now, but it'd be wonderful to sit down and actually work out what kind of studies we should be starting now. So there's just a question, because you've all got so much experience, and from the ethics, from the biology, and from your extensive knowledge of re-vegetating areas. So it'd just be wonderful to know that we can turn to you and start designing those studies now from scratch, before. So that's my question. Just adding on to you.
So Natalie, I'm thinking that maybe one of the biggest and most important actions that come out of this, that the Osmond Park Association, Bayside City Council, could work with Ian and Michael to actually, and Gio, George would be involved, but to maybe look at some trials and then take it from there. So maybe that's a good area to finish up on. I think Gio's comment that if we can get the noisy miners under control, we bump up the impact of a place like this almost 1,000-fold, at least 2 orders of magnitude. So it really is worth doing, I think. So I think now would be a great time to use the time to have lunch, to make sure people swap contacts and see where we get to from here. Thank you.
Hold on, everyone. Thanks, Joe, and thanks very much, Jacinta, for finishing off. Plenty of food there.